Hey, welcome to my guide on how to play Branded. A lot of people have asked me to make this, and it's something I've always wanted to do myself too. I've done my best in this video to explain how I like to play my version of Branded, so I hope you find it helpful in some way. This video will be broken down into sections. Firstly, I'll give a brief introduction to Branded. Next, I'll go over each card in the deck for an in-depth deck profile. Then there will be some more deck theory, and then I'll move on to the combos. Lastly, I'll go over some advice for how to play some of the common matchups with Branded. If you enjoy this video, or find any of it insightful, please kindly subscribe, I'd appreciate that very much. Anyway, let's start with that brief introduction to Branded. Branded is a powerful mid-range deck. When it goes first, it aims to set up a huge board with lots of disruptions and follow-up. These boards tend to be pretty layered, with disruptions coming from your monsters on the field, your back row, your hand, and even your graveyard. This makes Branded very resilient to board breakers. Even evenly matched is not very effective, as it will not get rid of your follow-up, and could still leave you with 3 disruptions. When Branded goes second, its plan is to break the opponent's board with its powerful engine, and then either OTK, or set up a board of its own. Branded also has a strong grind game, as it has a lot of ways to recycle its engine. It can't grind forever, but since its monsters are so big, you usually don't need to. Branded's biggest weakness is that it can't fit enough hand traps into the deck to deal with certain metas. It's also pretty weak to Ash Blossom, but as you'll see in this video, there's a lot of ways to get around that. Overall, Branded is a really strong, fun, and challenging deck to play. I highly recommend trying it out if you haven't done so already. Now let's look at the deck list. The deck you can see on the screen here is my current build of Branded. But as I'll mention a lot throughout the video, the optimal deck list will change all the time, and there's multiple other viable ways to play Branded too. The first card here is Duel and Bird. In the current meta, you have to play this card to have a chance going second against Super Heavy Samurai and Manadium. No other card stops Super Heavy Samurai as reliably as this one, since they can't combo after it resolves, and they also can't negate it using Ash, like they can for Max C. Remember that Super Heavy Samurai can't play Call by the Grave, so their only way to negate this card is with Gamma. But you can easily play around that by simply not using the Duel until after the opponent puts a monster on the board. Duel is not very good in the Branded mirror match, and it's really bad against Labyrinth. But Branded has a lot of cards that require a discard anyway, so drawing a dead card is often less of a problem for this deck than it is for other decks. Duel is also acceptable against Vanquish Soul, since a lot of their openers will want to search multiple times. It's also not that common for their first search to be for Snow Devil, usually it's something like Raisin, Rhoda, Prosperity, or Fenrir instead, and so Duel can often prevent them from getting to the Snow Devil. This is important in the matchup since Snow Devil is the most threatening tool that Vanquish Soul has for stopping Branded, so denying them access to it is huge. One thing to keep in mind about Duel is that it can actually combo with Branded in high spirits, since it's a spellcaster, which means you can send Gringwinjal to the graveyard, and then discard the Duel to search for a play. But of course, the non-engine cards in the deck are always subject to change anyway depending on the format. Even without new packs or new ban lists, players' perception of the format changes from week to week, and so the environment of decks, and the way they are built, also changes along with it. This is why you should reconsider your non-engine cards all the time. Right now, I think Duel is needed to deal with the meta, but that could easily change in the future. The next card here is Despian Tragedy. This card searches a Despia monster when it gets banished, or when it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect. The usual target for this is a Lubber, but it can also search for Quem, since Quem is always treated as a Despia monster, even while it's in the deck. Tragedy is mainly just used as a way to allow Foolish Burial and Gold Sarcophagus to search for a Lubber, but it can also be sent to the graveyard with Branded Fusion to summon Lubellion. Although that line is less common than it used to be. Tragedy also has a secondary effect to banish itself from the graveyard to reset a branded spell or trap to your field. This is a good effect to have, but since you can only use one effect of Tragedy per turn, not both, this gets used exclusively for follow-up on later turns, since the search effect is more important. Sometimes you'll see Branded lists that play more than one Tragedy, but I think this is a really bad idea, since the card is just terrible to draw. While it is true that drawing the tragedy means that Foolish and Gold Sark become unable to search for a lure, the chances of this happening are pretty low, and it's not like there aren't other uses for those cards either. Another idea you might see from some branded lists is to play 3 copies of Tragedy alongside Allure of Darkness. The objective is to draw 2 cards, then banish the Tragedy with Allure to get a bunch of card advantage. This is also not that good in my opinion, since Allure is kinda mediocre when it banishes anything other than Tragedy or Mercourier, and drawing Tragedy on its own without Allure is as terrible as always. You don't need to overcook when it comes to Tragedy, it's better to just play the one. Next we have Max C. Max C is in here because it's the single best card in the game, but there are actually some interesting points to make about Max C. Branded likes to draw a lot of engine cards, especially going first, but also going second too. This means that it doesn't like to draw too many non-engine cards, like hand traps and board breakers. Ideally, you want to draw just 1 non-engine card, maybe 2. If you draw more than 2, you're pretty likely to brick, or at least get stopped by a single disruption. This is why Branded tends to play less going second cards than other decks. Because of this, I've always preferred playing high-impact going second cards like Super Poly, Duel, Nibiru, or even Droplets, over the more common low-impact cards like Ash, Imperm, and Veiler. Most of the time, a single low-impact hand trap will not be enough to stop a deck from playing by itself, but a single high-impact card might be able to. Since you're only playing enough non-engine and Branded to draw a single one most of the time, you'd rather it be a high-impact card, so that it has more chance of actually stopping the opponent. Low-impact cards like Ash, Imperm, and Veiler are instead stronger in decks that play enough non-engine cards to reliably draw multiple of them. Max C is of course a high-impact card too, but only when it resolves. Sometimes Max C will just be countered by Ash or Called by the Grave, which makes it become a super low-impact card when that happens. Often you'll go second and Branded with nothing but Max C, the opponent will negate it, and then you're just dead in the water with no other hand traps, hoping to top deck exactly Super Poly. With Branded already being pretty strong at breaking boards with its engine, it's easy to think that a more reliable card that is guaranteed to have some impact every time would be better, like Droplets for example. You can also make the argument that Branded doesn't make the best use of Max C when it goes first either, since the end boards this deck makes usually have enough power and follow-up to win the game on their own. In the end though, Max C is just too good to not play. It also fills the specific role going second for Branded, of taking the Ash out of the opponent's hand, so that they don't have it for Branded Fusion on your turn. If they don't negate your Max C at all, then you're pretty certain that there's no Ash for Branded Fusion either, so you don't need to play around it. Also, when you go first with Max C, it's a pretty good way to force the opponent into using their Called by the Grave, which would have otherwise been a pretty good card at beating the Branded end board. So overall, don't be tempted to cut Max C from your deck, but it's actually not as unreasonable as it sounds. Sometimes when I play in tournaments that have side decks, I take out the Max C when I know I'm going first, just to reduce the chance that I'll brick. Next we have 3 Fallen of Albaz. This is the card that the whole deck revolves around. When it's normal or special summoned, you can discard a card, and then fusion summon something using it and one of the opponent's monsters. This is one of the strongest things you can do in Branded, since the Albaz fusions are really powerful, especially Mirror Jade, which you can almost always threaten to make since the opponent will probably have an extra deck monster on their end board. Technically it can fuse with more than one monster too, but that's not something you ever actually do. Albaz gets used a lot just because it's the required material to summon your good fusion monsters, but the current version of Branded also makes good use of its effect as a disruption, by summoning it as a quick effect on the opponent's turn. Since you always want to have access to Albaz, and it never hurts to have extra access to it, I don't personally see a good reason not to play all 3 copies of it. However, some players do prefer to play just 2. One argument you could make for playing just 2 is that it doesn't do anything on its own, so opening too many of them going first could cause you to brick. Also, you might want to cut one to make room in your deck for something else. I don't really like either of these reasons though. Drawing Albaz sometimes lets you play through Ash, making it not a terrible draw, and having access to the 3rd Albaz helps a lot in grindy games. One mistake that is easy to make with Albaz is thinking that it's a good draw going second, because you can normal summon it, use the effect, and break the opponent's board. In practice this will hardly ever resolve, and that means you will have wasted your normal summon, as well as discarded a card for nothing. This is not a good way to force your opponent's interaction. Most of the time it's still stronger to go for a Looper as your normal summon going second. Summoning Albaz with fusion deployment can be a good way to break a board though, since it doesn't use up your normal summon. Alubert the Jester of Despia. This card searches for any branded spell or trap when it's normal or special summoned. This is what makes the deck consistently get to branded fusion. Instead of having just the one copy of branded fusion, you instead have 7, between the Alubers and the cards that get to Aluber. This is by far the main normal summon of the deck. You can also normal summon Quem, but that's usually not as strong as just going for Aluber. Most of the time you want to summon Quem with Titaniclad instead, which you'll see when we get to the combos section. Aluber also has another effect while it's in the graveyard. If a face-up fusion monster you control gets destroyed by battle, or leaves the field by a card effect, Aluber can target an opponent's monster, special summon itself back to the field, and then negate that monster's effect. Just like Tragedy, you can only use one effect of Aluber per turn, so you can't also then surge after summoning him back. The second effect is mainly used as extra protection for your end board, but not every combo actually leaves Aluber in the graveyard anyway, as sometimes he gets banished instead. Having Aluber in the graveyard is really good way at stopping access code from killing you, since as soon as they destroy a fusion monster, you can stop the access code from destroying anything else, and also lower its attack back down to 2,300. You can also make good use of Aluber alongside Mirror Jade too, by negating something that can't be destroyed by card effects, so that the Mirror Jade can still destroy it during the end phase. Another cool trick you can do is to wait until a fusion summon Mirror Jade is destroyed before using the Aluber's effect. That way you can use the Mirror Jade as Chain Link 1 and the Aluber as Chain Link 2 to prevent the opponent from negating the Mirror Jade with something like Appaloosa or Baron de Fleur. Aluber is one of the best draws in the deck, so you're always happy to see this in your hand. Then there's Tri-Brigade Mare Courier. This can negate a monster effect by sending itself from the hand or field to the graveyard. A lot of combos will search this card with Branded Lost either on your own turn, but also very often on the opponent's turn too. You use this card as a negate all the time, but it also has another effect which you also use all the time. If it gets banished, you can search for any monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz, or for Fallen of Albaz himself. It doesn't matter where it gets banished from, you'll still be able to get the search. So you can banish it from the deck with Gold Sarcophagus, from the graveyard with a Bastille, or from the hand or field with something like Albion. It won't get its effect when banished face down though, so remember that Kashtira cards will not trigger it. Some combos will send Mare Courier to the graveyard with Branded Fusion to summon Rindbrum, which sets it up to be banished later on by a Bastille, or even something like Branded in White. And you can also use both effects of Mare Courier in the same turn too. One way you might make use of that is to negate a monster effect on the opponent's turn and then banish the Mare Courier with a Bastille later in that same turn to get a search. You could even use the Bestial to stop Called by the Grave from negating the Mare Courier. The fact that this card can use its negate while on the field too is something important to remember, since it gives you the option of reviving it with Quem. There's no reason not to play at least one Mare Courier in the deck, since the extra combos it gives access to are way too valuable to pass up on. Although the card is a huge brick, so I don't recommend playing any more than one. Some branded lists do like to play two though. The reason for this is to allow you to banish Mare Courier during a combo, and then also search for a copy to help play around Nibiru, or to hold as a disruption for the opponent's turn. In general though, I don't find this to be that important, since Nibiru is not really a threat for branded, and you're not very reliant on the Mare Courier negate being part of your end board, as it's usually strong enough without it. So if you don't have another Mare Courier to search because your only copy is banished, it's not the end of the world, and certainly not enough reason to make me want to play two. Springin's Kit is next. Kit can special summon herself from the hand if you have an Albaz fusion on the field or in the graveyard. And then when it's normal or special summoned, it can add a branded spell or trap from the deck, graveyard, or banished zone to your hand. You then have to put a card from your hand onto the bottom of the deck. This card looks like a starter card at first glance, since it can search for branded fusion, but it's actually better to just use this as an optional extender. Having to put back a card from your hand is not an ideal way to start your combo. Kit's effect is not technically a -1, but you should always think of it like that, since the kit on the board offers very little value once it's used its effect. For this reason, you definitely only want to be playing one kit. unless your deck is 60 cards, in which case you might consider more for the consistency. The main way to use Kit is to search it with Branded Lost, or with Mare Courier, and then add an extra spell or trap to either use as extra disruption for the opponent's turn, or to extend right away. Typically Kit will search for Branded in red, or Branded in white, but it can of course get everything else as well. Another huge use for Kit is to add back Branded Fusion from the graveyard, since you only have the one copy of it. It's not the only way to recycle Branded Fusion, you also have Tragedy and Retribution, but Kit is the best way to do it, since you can always access Kit through the effect of Sprint, which you can send to the graveyard with Mirror Jade. Kit is also the only way to add back Branded Fusion from the banished zone. So if you're playing against Runic, or Kashtira, or against Dimension Shifter, the Branded Fusion isn't lost forever if it gets banished. Sometimes you'll even banish Branded Fusion yourself with Fusion Duplication, in which case, you'll need Kit to get it back. Then we have Blazing Cartesia the Virtuous. If you have Albaz on your field or in your graveyard, you can special summon this from your hand. She has a quick effect to fusion summon a level 8 or higher fusion monster during the main phase, using monsters from your hand or field as material. And then also, during the end phase, you can add her back from the graveyard to your hand, as long as a fusion monster was sent to your graveyard that turn. So many of your combos use this card. She plays really well against Impermanence, Max C, and when you draw Albaz alongside her, she can even beat Ash Blossom too. This card is important for being able to trigger Branded Lost after you bring it out with Libellion, since you don't usually get to Branded Lost until after you resolve Branded Fusion. She's also required for the summon of Gran Winyal, which is a super versatile tool that you want to be using all the time. If you play the Puppet Lock in your deck, Gran Winyal is the main way that you access it, which means Cartesia is crucial too. Cartesia lets you play on the opponent's turn, which is exactly what you want to be doing a lot of in Branded. If you're wondering why there is only one copy of this card in the deck, the reason is that Cartesia is highly searchable, and it's much better to summon her with Fusion Deployment instead. Also, I think Cartesia is actually a pretty bad draw most of the time, since getting Albaz into the graveyard is not trivial, and you really don't want to have to spend your normal summon on this card. The best card to summon with her on turn 1 is Gran Winyal, since it sets up whatever Albaz fusion you want in the end phase, among other options. And then the best card to summon with Cartesia on the opponent's turn is either Sanctifier Dragon or Albion, to go into further fusion summons that disrupt the opponent. Cartesia's end phase effect to add itself back to your hand is also really useful at making sure you always have a discard in your hand, particularly for Albaz effect on the opponent's turn. One mistake you don't want to make with this card is thinking that it can be used to make Guardian Chimera. Chimera only gets its effect when summoned using a spell card, so make sure you don't fall for that. So next is Guiding Quem the Virtuous. When it's normal or special summoned, this card can send an Albaz, or any card that mentions it, from the deck to the graveyard. This effect is really strong since putting an extra Albaz into the graveyard is how you make end boards that have a lot of disruption. Having Albaz in the graveyard for the opponent's turn means you can always revive it with Rindbrum, which you can send to the graveyard using Mirror Jade. Also, it gives you more options with how to use Branded in red, since the Albaz allows you to go into Albaz fusions too, whereas when you target a Despia with it, you're limited to Chimera most of the time. Also, Albaz in the graveyard can be used for Quem's second effect as well. If a card leaves either extra deck, you can target Albaz, or any monster that mentions it, and special summon it from your graveyard to your field. This second effect is what makes Quem actually really crazy. When you go first, there are combos where you use Quem to revive Cartesia, so that you have it on your end board, but you also sometimes bring back Albaz to use it as fusion material too. On the opponent's turn, you usually use this to revive an Albaz, so that you can fuse away their monsters. But you will also use this just as often to revive something like Mirror Jade as well, since all of the Albaz fusions are also monsters that mention Albaz. Getting a card to leave the extra deck for Quem is really easy. Sometimes the opponent will trigger it by summoning something, but you can also trigger it yourself with something like Banishment, Branded in red, Sanctifier, or Cartesia. You can even trigger Quem with Mirror Jade's effect, since it sends a monster out of the extra deck for cost. This is actually something that you can do turn 1 in some of the combo lines too. Another thing to note about Quem is that it's always treated as a Despia monster and a Dogmatica monster even while it's in the deck. This means you can search for it with Tragedy, or Nadir Servant, and target it with Branded in red, or Banishment. It also means you can also summon it with Titaniclad, which is the main way that you actually get to this card. Typically you will send Titaniclad with something like Grand Wignol or High Spirits, and then summon out the Quem in the end phase. This is the reason why I like playing only one. It's much better to spend your normal summon on a Luber, and then special summon the Quem during the end phase. It's also true that Quem is not a starter card by itself. The best play you can make with just Quem is to normal summon it, send Albaz, and then pass turn, hoping that the opponent plays into the revive effect. If you have Quem alongside Shrouded Dragon, or any way to get Branded Fusion into the graveyard, then you can sometimes start your plays with Quem by sending Retribution. But this requires specific cards, and it's not something you can rely on. If you're playing a 60-card deck, then it's actually not too bad to play multiple Quem. It combos well with the extra copies of Shrouded Dragon that a lot of 60-card lists like to play. Next up is Bestial Serenir. This card can summon itself from the hand by banishing a light or dark monster from either graveyard. If the opponent has a monster on their board, then this effect to summon becomes a quick effect. Also, when Serenir is sent to the graveyard, it can send a bestial monster, or a branded spell or trap from your deck to the graveyard. Serenir is a good extender to draw since it works well with most other cards in the deck. The effect to send a branded spell or trap is used in a lot of combos, and the fact that it triggers no matter where the Serenir is sent from means that it's a really good discard for cards like Opening, Super Poly, and Lubellion. Cards that would otherwise not work on their own, like Deployment or High Spirits, become really good when you pair them with Serenir. Typically this will send Retribution, and then the Retribution will add back another spell or trap that you send using Shrouded Dragon or Quem. You should think of Serenir as half of a search card. Its first effect to banish a light or dark monster also has combo potential too, and in a lot of lines you'll use Serenir to banish your own Mercourier from the graveyard. Since Serenir doubles as an engine card, it doesn't cause you to brick as much as a regular hand trap or board breaker would. This is a luxury that any bestial deck gets to enjoy whenever bestials are good against the meta, so it makes sense to take advantage of it while you can. If bestials aren't good hand traps for any matchup in the meta, then the amount of bestials in the deck might need to change in order to respect that. The minimum amount of Serenir you can play in the deck is 1 copy, since it's still essential for many of your combos. Bestial Druisworm is another bestial like Serenir. You can special summon it from the hand by banishing a light or dark monster from either graveyard. And it's a quick effect if the opponent controls a monster. When it's sent from the field to the graveyard, it can target an opponent's special summon monster and send it to the graveyard. Druisworm is in the deck for a few reasons. Firstly, it's a bestial, so it's a solid hand trap against the right matchups. Also, it's good to play a second target for Lubellion, since I'm playing more than 1 copy of it, as well as all 3 copies of Serenir, so it's not unlikely that it'll draw Serenir and Lubellion together. Another reason to play Druisworm is that it makes Lubellion a much better card to draw going second. Serenir isn't very good at breaking a board, and neither is Magnamut or Baldrake for that matter, but Druisworm actually is. All you have to do is search it with the Lubellion, summon it out using something from the opponent's graveyard, and then tribute it to summon back the Lubellion, which will trigger the Druisworm's graveyard effect. A play like that will probably force some interaction from the opponent, but the same can't be said if you were to do it with any other bestial. Druisworm is also a nice way to out certain problematic monsters, like Scareclaw Tri-Heart or Sword Soul Supreme Sovereign. Even though you can out those cards in other ways, sometimes Druisworm is the most efficient, since usually the only investment it requires is a single Lubellion. My favorite way to use Druisworm is alongside Sanctifier Dragon. If you have Albaz and Druisworm in your graveyard, you can special summon the Albaz to your field and the Druisworm to the opponent's field. Then you can use Albaz to fuse with the Druisworm into Lubellion or Furious Dragon, which will then trigger the Druisworm to clear one of the opponent's monsters. This is a good play to make when you don't have a way to fuse with the opponent's monster, because of its awkward type and attribute, or because the summon of Lubellion or Furious Dragon is needed specifically. Now, with that being said, Druisworm is one of the most cuttable cards in the deck. As soon as bestials stop being good, it's gonna be better to use the slot for something else. The same is probably true for 1 or 2 of the Serenirs too. Next we have Albion the Shrouded Dragon. If you have this in your hand or graveyard, you can send an Albaz, or a branded spell or trap from your deck to the graveyard, to put this card back onto the bottom of the deck, then draw a card if it was used from your hand. It's also treated as Fallen of Albaz while on the field or in the graveyard. This card is really important for a lot of your combos. It pairs with Serenir's Graveyard effect to effectively search a branded spell or trap by sending the Retribution with Serenir and then sending the card you want with Shrouded. It's also really useful for sending Albaz to the graveyard to make cards like Cartesia live, or just to put it there for the opponent's turn so that you have a stronger end board. Sending Albaz with this at the start of your turn can also help play around Bestials from banishing your only Albaz in response to Albion. You can play more than one copy of this, since it is just Upstart Goblin, but better for this deck. However, it is once per turn, and a lot of combos like to use this later on as a search target when you know exactly what you want to send with it. Most of the time I find that when I open this card and use it right away, I'm actually guessing which card I need to send to the graveyard. Between Retribution and Albaz, it can be hard to tell what you need, since you don't know how you're going to get hand trapped yet, and you also don't know what card you're going to draw with Shrouded's effect. This card is at its best when you are already comboing and don't care about what you draw, and you just want to send something to the graveyard. The fact that it's treated as Albaz while in the graveyard sometimes comes up for Branded in Red or Cartesia, but most of the time that effect doesn't matter, since this card leaves the graveyard for its own effect and can always just send a real Albaz instead. There is also a secret mode to this card that very rarely comes up, but is pretty cool when it does. It can actually be special summoned to the field if you send a card from your hand to the graveyard instead of from the deck. This might come up when pushing for lethal since it has 2500 attack, but is more likely to come up as a way to get an Albaz fusion onto the board, but utilizing the fact that Shrouded Dragon becomes Albaz while on the field. One time you might use the card like this is when all 3 copies of Albaz are banished, and you want to go into an Albaz fusion using Cartesia. Then we have the Bestial Lubellion. Lubellion can be discarded from your hand to search for a bestial monster. You can also special summon it from your hand or graveyard by tributing a level 6 or higher Dark Dragon monster. While it's on the field, you can also place a continuous branded spell or trap from your deck onto the field. This is the main light target to send with Branded Fusion when you're summoning Albion, and its main purpose is to put the Albion into the graveyard, as well as to get Branded Lost onto the field. Branded Lost is by far the best target for this card, as almost all of your turn 1 combos use Branded Lost at some point. It's also the strongest target going second too, since it forces interaction from the opponent. This is one of the reasons I'm not playing any other targets for Lubellion, and it's also one of the reasons that I like playing multiple Lubellion. Drawing Lubellion going first can lead to some of the deck's strongest combos. A Luber plus Lubellion, for example, can create one of the strongest end boards possible with just those 2 cards. It's hard to completely brick on Bestials when one of those Bestials is Lubellion, since it guarantees a special summon by itself, which means you can probably make a competent play with Verte Anaconda. With Druisworm being in the deck, it makes Lubellion stronger to draw going second, because of how forcing Druisworm can be. This means that even though Lubellion is not a hand trap Bestial, it's still not a card you are unhappy to see in your hand going second. And finally, drawing Lubellion means that you have the option of sending Cartesia to the graveyard with Branded Fusion as the light target for Albion, without having to give up access to the Lubellion. This comes up when you get an early Quem onto the field, and you can use its effect to revive the Cartesia after the Branded Fusion resolves. The biggest downside of Lubellion is drawing too many copies of it going second, especially when you don't draw a hand that makes use of sending a different light monster to the graveyard with Branded Fusion. It also starts taking up a lot of much-needed deck space if you play a lot of Lubellion, which is why I've settled on playing 2. You could absolutely play all 3 though, and cut the Serenir down to 2, or just throw in the 3rd anyway and make the deck 50 cards. You can also make a case that the card is only needed at 1. So if you were trying to build a list that was closer to 40 cards, then 1 Lubellion is fine. I think it's strongest at 2 or 3 though, and if I were to build a 40-card branded deck, I'd personally be trying to play multiple Lubellion anyway. Foolish Burial is here just because it's an extra copy of a Luber. You can sometimes find other uses for the card since it's obviously a very generic effect, and branded does have a lot of graveyard synergies. But the only reason it makes it into the deck list is because it can send Tragedy to search for a Luber. If you already have a Luber when you draw this, the next most likely target you're gonna send is either Serenir, to send a spell or trap, or Albaz to set up for the opponent's turn. Gold Sarcophagus is exactly the same as Foolish Burial. It's only here to be another copy of a Luber. Unlike Foolish Burial though, Gold Sarcophagus can also banish Mare Courier, which allows you to search for a lot of other cards too. But you still only really play this to search for a Lubber. Next up is Fusion Deployment. This card lets you reveal a fusion monster in your extra deck, and then special summon one of the monsters that is specifically listed as material for that monster from your hand or deck. You can also only summon fusion monsters from the extra deck during the turn you activate the card, which is the exact same restriction as branded fusion. Deployment either summons Cartesia by revealing Gran Winyal or Albaz by revealing any Albaz fusion. Going first, this card mostly summons Cartesia, and then going second it typically summons Albaz to try and fuse away the opponent's board. Although there are a lot of times where you want Cartesia going second too. You might summon Cartesia instead of Albaz into a board that has a lot of unknown set cards, or a lot of monsters with negates, since you're pretty certain that Albaz wouldn't resolve, and you don't want to waste a card by discarding it to activate his effect. When you go first, deployment combos pretty well with Serenir, Aluber, and Lubellion, as well as having an acceptable play when you draw just Albaz as well. The card is great for playing around Imperm and Veiler, since the Cartesia just protects everything by being able to chain her effect, and then fusing away whatever the opponent targets. This card can also summon from hand instead of deck, so if you draw the Cartesia, you can technically still summon it with deployment if you wanted to. However, a better play would be to summon Albaz from deck instead, and then special summon Cartesia with her own effect. Another great use for this card is as a target for triple tactics thrust. This happens more often than you might think, as thrust for deployment is a much stronger play after you've baited the opponent's interaction, since Albaz is more likely to resolve. Deployment is also a target for fusion duplication too, which then becomes yet another way in which this deck can summon out Albaz on the opponent's turn. A very small trick you can do with deployment when summoning Albaz is to reveal a different Albaz fusion than the one you intend to summon with that Albaz. You never know when this might confuse the opponent, and there's always a chance that they don't know the materials for Mirror Jade, so don't remind them. One big downside to fusion deployment is that it conflicts with Branded and High Spirits. High Spirits requires a monster to combo with, and usually deployment does too, so drawing them both together could easily lead to a brick. Also, High Spirits combos tend to like going into Anaconda, which you can't make during the turn you use deployment because of the restriction. Overall though, deployment is an amazing card that helps the deck play through hand traps going first, and increases its ability to break boards going second. There is no reason not to play 3 of this card in my opinion. Branded in white is here because it's needed for some combos. Also, the card can help push through boards when you go second, it's even searchable with thrust. In a long grind game, you are really happy about having access to this card, as it's hardly any different to Branded Fusion once you have a lot set up in the graveyard. Branded in white allows you to fusion summon any monster using your hand or field, but you have to include at least 1 dragon as the materials. If you use Albaz as material though, you can banish materials from your graveyard as well. So you can summon a fusion by just banishing monsters from your graveyard, as long as one of those monsters is Albaz. Remember that Albaz himself is a dragon. When you go first, it's very common for a combo that uses Branded in white to use it with monsters on your field, not just the graveyard. So don't try too hard to always only use the graveyard, thinking that it's the best way to use this card. Sometimes it's more important to put a monster from your field into the graveyard, like Albion, Gran Winyal, or Albaz himself, because of the value they have in the graveyard. When you go second with this card though, you typically will try to banish all the materials from the graveyard, as it's a very efficient way to put something on the board after the opponent has stopped your Albaz. It pairs really well with deployment, since deployment can get to Albaz, which forces the opponent's negates, and then Branded in white can push afterwards, regardless of whether the Albaz gets destroyed and sent to the graveyard, or is still on the field. Branded in white also has another effect that rarely gets used. If you send it to the graveyard to activate the effect of Albaz, it can reset itself onto the field during the end phase. This effect usually doesn't matter, but it's nice to know for when you have Branded in white in your hand when you use Albaz on the opponent's turn. You can discard it for the Albaz, and then in the opponent's end phase, it'll reset to your field, so you can then use it on your turn. It saves you having to discard any other card, although very often you'll have Cartesia or High Spirits anyway, which fills the same role of being a recurring card to discard. Technically, you can also trigger Branded in White's second effect with Shrouded Dragon, as long as the Shrouded Dragon was in the graveyard when it activated the effect, since it is treated as regular Albaz while in the graveyard. In truth, this card is not essential for the deck, and it can be one of the worser draws to have going first. Some of the turn 1 combos that use Branded in White can also be done with Branded in Red instead, although they are slightly better with Branded in White. You could make the argument that Branded in White should be cut. However, I don't think I would, because I really like the option of searching it going second, where you can sometimes play around Ash Blossom against a bricked opponent by going for a less efficient OTK with Branded in White instead of Branded Fusion. I think it's best to play this, although some lists recently have been cutting it. You'd never play more than one though, since it cannot play on its own, so it's very often a bricky draw, especially when you go first. Then there's Branded Fusion itself. It lets you fusion summon an Albaz fusion by using 2 monsters in your deck as material. That's the entire effect of the card, and it's the main reason that the deck is as good as it is. You're also locked into only summoning fusion monsters from the extra deck during the turn you use it, and this restriction applies even if the card gets ashed. Typically, you'll use this card to summon Albion or Lubellion or Sanctifier when the opponent uses Max C. Branded Fusion is by far the most efficient card in the deck, and is one of the only ways to play in this deck that doesn't require any previous setup, which is the reason it hurts so much when the card is negated. That being said, branded cards still have a lot of potential, even if Branded Fusion were to get banned. You can play a version of this deck that focuses on synchros, but potentially even a fusion build would be viable still, since Quem can allow you to play without Branded Fusion. Drawing the 1 copy of Branded Fusion is always really good. Going first, it lets you play through hand traps like Valor and Imperm really well, and even Ash Blossom sometimes, since it frees up the Aluber Surge for something else. And then going second, it lets you push into boards super easily, since Aluber will again attract the opponent's disruptions. Having just 1 copy of this card is not a big deal for Branded at all. There are multiple ways to get back to Branded Fusion, namely Kit, Retribution, and Tragedy, but there are also lots of games where you don't need to resolve a second Branded Fusion to win on turn 3 anyway. Next we have 3 copies of Triple Tactics Thrust. The reason why Thrust is good in Branded is that helps play through hand traps, especially Ash Blossom. If the opponent uses Ash on Branded Fusion, you can use Thrust to set Fusion Duplication, which can then copy the Branded Fusion on the opponent's turn. It's not as strong as resolving Branded Fusion on your own turn, but still pretty good. You can summon out Sanctifier to set up a way to fuse with an opponent's monster into Mirror Jade, or you can go for Albion or Lubellion to make Mirror Jade directly. If your opponent plays into Thrust without negating Branded Fusion, then the duplication becomes even stronger, since using it in addition to an already existing board is exceptionally strong. In positions like that, you typically use the duplication to summon out Sanctifier if the end board doesn't already have it, or Albion to then go into Borload Furious Dragon. Duplication is usually the best target for Thrust when you use it going first, although it can also set Banishment or Branded King for when you already have the duplication in hand. Even when the opponent hand traps you with something like a Bestial or a Gamma that would put a monster on their board and allow Thrust to instead add any normal spell, it's often still better to go for Fusion Duplication anyway. The exception to this would be if the opponent prevents you from getting to Branded Fusion, like using Gamma on a Aluber for example. In that situation, you can use Thrust to simply add the Branded Fusion to your hand. When you go second with Thrust, the card's main target becomes Branded Fusion, Fusion Deployment, or Branded in White, since the opponent will most likely control a monster, allowing Thrust to search instead of setting. You should always keep in mind the option of getting the traps anyway though, even when going second into a board, because they are sometimes still the best play available. Nadir Servant is also a target for Thrust, as is that Grass Looks Greener, for the 60 card builds. Although I would be scared to get Grass instead of Branded Fusion, since there's no guarantee that resolving Grass in this deck will even be as good as a Branded Fusion. Thrust is often played with Triple Tactics talents too, so you might be wondering why I don't play at least 1 copy. It's true that a copy of Talents would help going second, since it's Circle with Thrust, and has good application for breaking boards and pushing for lethal. But the card takes up a slot in the deck, and drawing it directly when going second is usually not good enough to break a board, since Branded doesn't have a lot of hand traps to simplify the game, and so you're often going against full combo boards, which never lose to a single Talents. Of course, it's still good in the matchups that can't negate it, like the Mirror Match and Vanquish Soul, but against Super Heavy Samurai, Vanadium, or Mathmech, Talents will not be effective on its own. Additionally, going first with Talents is weird in Branded, since it usually doesn't save you from Ash on Branded Fusion. If your Branded Fusion gets ashed, drawing 2 cards will probably still not be enough to let you play, and looking at the opponent's hand is only going to be effective if you can shuffle back their only starter card. If they draw multiple ways to play, you could easily still be losing because you weren't able to set up any disruptions through the Ash Blossom. This can very easily come up against Super Heavy Samurai, since all they have to do to beat the Talents is draw more than one of the Super Heavy Samurai starter cards. I like Thrust at 3 because drawing a hand that can beat Ash Blossom is so important in this deck. Between Thrust, Called by the Grave, Fusion Duplication, and Branded in High Spirits, you have 9 cards in the deck that all allow you to play pretty well into Ash, which comes out at a 65% chance to draw at least one of them in a 5-card opening hand. Breaking on too many thrusts is a real problem, but with how many ways there is to discard dead cards in Branded, drawing a thrust when you need it is easily worth the risk of drawing 2, or drawing a thrust when the opponent has no hand traps. The best argument against playing Thrust is that you need the deck space for cards that are better at going second, since Thrust is mainly in the list for going first, and its uses going second are generally only medium impact. If the meta requires a lot of hand traps, Thrust is a good candidate to cut for them. Against the current meta of Super Heavy Samurai though, Thrust is still very attractive, because that deck plays a lot of hand traps, all of which are monsters. Branded Lost is next. This card says, the activation of your cards and effects that include an effect that fusion summons a fusion monster cannot be negated. Also, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects when a monster is fusion summoned this way. What this means is that while Branded Lost is on the field, when you use an effect to fusion summon, like Albaz, Branded Fusion, or Cartesia, the opponent cannot negate it with something like Baron de Fleur, Savage Dragon, or Solemn Strike, since all these cards specifically negate activations. But they are still allowed to try and negate your activation, so the opponent can still chain Baron's effect, it just won't actually stop your card from resolving as normal. If the opponent were to use a card that does not negate activations, but instead just negates effects, like Regulus, Imperm, and Ash Blossom, then Branded Lost would not protect you, and your effect would not resolve. This is why Ash Blossom can stop Branded Fusion, even while Branded Lost is on the field. Also, remember that as long as the effect fusion summons at some point, the Branded Lost protection will still apply. So Banishment, as well as Branded in Red, also cannot have their activations negated even though the first part of their effect is not a fusion summon, and the fusion summon itself is optional. On the other hand, Verte Anaconda and Fusion Duplication do not benefit from the Branded Lost protection, since their effects do not technically include a fusion summon, and they instead just copy another card's effect at the time of resolution. In other words, Baron can still negate these cards, even while Branded Lost is on the field. After you fusion summon, Branded Lost also prevents the opponent from activating any cards or effects in response to the summon of that monster. This means that trigger effects that activate after you fusion summon, like Albion, Grand Winyal, or Guardian Chimera, cannot be responded to by the opponent. You can also then chain your own quick effects in response to these triggers, and the opponent will not be able to chain to those effects either. One way to make good use of this is to use Mirror Jade's effect in response to its own fusion summon, so that the opponent doesn't have a chance to respond. Something important to realize though, is that you can only deny the opponent the ability to respond if you fusion summon as Chainlink 1. If something else that isn't a fusion summon happens as Chainlink 1, then on the new chain, the opponent will have the ability to respond. So, if the opponent activates Imperm targeting my Cartesia as Chainlink 1, and I then chain Cartesia as Chainlink 2 to fuse into Albion, when the Albion's effect triggers on the next chain, the opponent will still be able to respond with another Imperm even if Branded Lost is on the field. This is because the Cartesia effect was not Chainlink 1. So if you don't want the opponent to be able to respond, make sure you use effects like Branded in Red, Banishment, Cartesia, Albion, or Lubellion as Chainlink 1. Typically you'll see Branded players using Branded Fusion to go into Albion, which then summons Lubellion, which then summons out Mirror Jade, which then uses its effect to banish a monster, and the opponent is unable to respond the entire time, providing that Lost is on the field. This is because the Branded player used Branded Fusion as Chainlink 1, then on the next chain they used Albion as Chainlink 1, and on the next chain they used Lubellion as Chainlink 1. And then on the next chain they used Mirror Jade in response to its own summon. Using Branded Lost to make plays that the opponent can't respond to is a huge part of mastering Branded, so make sure you get familiar with how to use this card. Branded Lost also has another effect. Once per turn, when you fusion summon, you can search for an Albaz, or any monster that mentions it. This normally searches for Mare Courier, Kit, or Shrouded Dragon, but a lot of combos also use it to search for Albaz too. Cartesia and Quem are also targets for this card, but you won't typically be searching for those, since most combos get to Quem and Cartesia through other means. The search effect will also trigger when you fusion summon on the opponent's turn, so you can get a lot of searches from Lost over the course of an entire game. Often you'll search something like Kit, or Shrouded, to extend further on your own turn, and then search for Mare Courier on the opponent's turn to have an extra disruption. Branded Lost is by far the most common card that you want to bring out with Lebellion's effect, which is why my list is playing Lost as the only target. The card is needed for most combos because of the search effect, but there are also a lot of matchups where the effect to deny the opponent a chance to respond is crucial. In the mirror match, it's important to use Lost in order to destroy the opponent's set Branded Banishment, before they can use it to fuse away your board. Similarly, in the Runic matchup, you want to destroy Fountain at a time where the opponent can't respond, so that they can't chain a Runic spell to protect it with the effect of Hugin. Against Tearlaments, using Super Poly would normally trigger the graveyard effects, but with Branded Lost on the field, they won't be able to activate anything on the resolution of your fusion summon. Sometimes when I go second, I find myself wishing I played more copies of this, since it often forces interaction by itself, but because the card is so easily accessible with Lebellion, overall it's better to just play the one. Next there's Super Polymerization. Super Poly has always been exceptionally good in Branded, since it doesn't require the opponent to summon all of the materials for a fusion monster themselves. This means that it's good in way more matchups than if you were to play Super Poly in a different deck. In Branded, most of the time you want to use this to summon Mirror Jade, using Albaz along with one of the opponent's monsters. It's much better to do this than to summon a Mud Dragon or Garura, even though you get to clear 2 of the opponent's monster, since Mirror Jade is just a much more threatening card. Even when you don't draw Albaz, you can usually access it through something like Deployment, High Spirits, or Mercourier's Banish effect, in order to make the Super Poly live. You'll notice that I don't actually play either Mud Dragon or Garura in my extra deck. The reason for this is that I want the slots for other cards that I think are more important. It's not that the Super Poly targets are bad, they're actually both pretty good, it's just that the extra deck is extremely tight, and I think the 15 cards here are all more important than Mud Dragon and Garura. That being said, Mud Dragon has a lot of good uses right now, and I'm very close to putting it back into the deck. One use for Mud Dragon that I think is really important is that you can summon it with Raisin and Jiaolong at the start of your turn. If you toggle on, you can use Super Poly with turn player priority to clear the Jiaolong before they even get a chance to search with it. This leaves the Vanquished Soul player in an awkward spot where they might not have access to the right attributes for the trap card. Mud Dragon can also be summoned using Baron and Appaloosa. This is a great way to combat a super heavy Samurai end board, as well as a Manadium end board too. Although, in the case of those decks, Draco Equest is also a neat option that can be summoned with Baron and Savage, or Baron and Dissipator. This is even stronger than Mud Dragon since the card has 3200 attack, and can attack over the Appaloosa too. You would probably never play a quest though, because it's only useful against specifically those 2 decks, and the extra deck is already very tight. But it's worth noting that the card exists as you could theoretically play it as a good side deck card. If you wanted to play Mud Dragon in the extra deck, the best card to cut would be either the Chimera, the Dragostopelia, or the Sprint. Although I still currently prefer what those cards offer over the Mud Dragon. It's worth mentioning that using Super Poly to fuse Baron and Appaloosa into Mud Dragon does not guarantee a win versus the super heavy Samurai end board. The Mud Dragon does not do anything to help clear the remaining disruptions, and the opponent will often still have multiple hand traps in hand as well. It's because of this that I think the best way to use Super Poly against those boards is to try and summon Albaz so that you can make Mirror Jade. Mirror Jade is pretty much immune to hand traps once it's on the board, and it's capable of clearing everything all on its own. Garura is a little bit inferior to Mud Dragon, since it's more likely to get summoned by using Super Poly as a disruption on the opponent's turn, rather than as a board breaker going second. Branded is already exceptionally strong at going first, so you don't need something like Super Poly to back up your end board. Going second is harder for Branded, and so a target that helps break boards has more chance of deciding the outcome of a game. There are occasionally matchups where Garura can be better than Mud Dragon going second, like Sprite for example, as you can fuse away the elf and the carrot before the main phase. But in the current meta, it's more likely that the opponent's endboard is vulnerable to Mud Dragon, Dragostopelia, Furious Dragon, or sometimes even Proskenion instead. One other thing I should mention about Garura is that you can also send it to the graveyard with Gran Winyal to draw a card. However, that play is very bad, as there is a million other targets that are better to send than Garura. Super Poly can also be a lifeline for when you brick going first. You'd be surprised how many games you can win by just setting Albaz and Super Poly. As soon as the opponent puts an extra deck monster onto the field, you can immediately fuse it away for Mirror Jade, even though the Albaz is face down. That Mirror Jade can then banish another monster by sending Rintbrum to the graveyard, which can then revive the Albaz to fuse away another monster from the opponent's board. If that Albaz is able to summon something like a Furious Dragon, or even another Mirror Jade when the opponent removes the first one, then that would be a total of 4 disruptions, even though you bricked. Since Branded is usually able to put a lot of cards into its hand in the end phase if you need to, getting a card in hand for Super Poly on the opponent's turn is never difficult. Another way that Super Poly sometimes gets used is during your own battle phase to fuse 2 of your monsters into Dragostopelia to push for lethal. Depending on the format, Super Poly is however a good candidate to cut for extra hand traps, since it is still just a non-engine card, and is therefore reliant on its matchups. Right now it's very strong against the meta though, so I wouldn't cut it. Call by the Grave is in the deck, and it's pretty obvious why. Branded is weak to Ash Blossom, as well as Max C, so it makes sense to play this to have a chance of just negating those cards for free. You typically combo with just 2 or 3 cards, so Call by is never really intrusive in your opening hand. The only reason you prefer to have around 4 engine cards in Branded is because of the opponent's hand traps, which Call by the Grave can just negate. You never need to worry about Call by being useless when the opponent has no hand traps, since your uninterrupted combo will probably win the game on its own. Also, hand traps get used early on against branded combos, so by the time you get to Lubellion's effect, you can be pretty sure that you don't need Call by anymore, so it can then just be the discard for Lubellion's effect. This card is also pretty good in the mirror match when you go second, since it can stop effects like Sanctifier, Banishment, or Branded in Red from resolving. Next up is Branded Opening. This card discards a card to either search for a Despia monster, or special summon it from the deck in defense position. Afterwards, you are locked into only summoning fusion monsters from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. You mainly use this because it's just another way to get to Aluber, the same reason why you play Gold Sarcophagus and Foolish Burial, but it can also get to Quem too. Using it to get Quem is a really strong play when you already have access to Aluber, since you can normal summon the Aluber, and then use Opening to summon Quem from the deck. Opening lets you play around Droll by using it during the draw phase, but it's usually better to save Opening for the main phase anyway, in order to play around other hand traps. You can play better into Max C by not using Opening as your first play, so that you can chain it to Max C and special summon out Aluber or Quem. It's safer to use Opening after fusion deployment, since having the Cartesia on the field will keep Aluber safe from Imperm and Veiler. Droll is also not typically very strong against Branded anyway, since most hands can get to Branded Fusion in less than 2 searches, which is able to still set up Mirror Jade and Banishment by itself at a minimum. Branded Opening also has a graveyard effect. If your fusion monster would be destroyed by a card effect, you can banish Opening from the graveyard instead. This effect does not activate, which means it cannot be negated, and it can also protect multiple fusion monsters at the same time. It does only protect fusion monsters, so cards like Cartesia, Quem, and the Bestial Lubellion, which are often on your end board, cannot be protected with this effect. If the opponent tries to destroy your whole board with something like Rigeki, Opening can be used to protect, but it will only save the fusion monsters, everything else will still be destroyed. A common way to use Opening is in combination with Borlode Furious Dragon. You can use its effect to target itself, or any other fusion monster you control, and then one of the opponent's cards. When the effect resolves, you can use Opening to protect your own monster, and the opponent's card will still get destroyed. There's also some lines where you might actually set Opening with Albion in the end phase. This is one of the better draws in the deck, so you're always happy to see Opening in your hand. Then we have Branded in High Spirits. This card lets you reveal a monster in your hand, and then send a level 8 fusion with the same type from your extra deck to your graveyard. You can then optionally discard the monster you revealed to search for Albaz, or any monster that mentions it. High Spirits is one of your starter cards, like Allure or Opening, which is why it's good to play all 3 copies of it. This is the best starter card for playing around Ash Blossom, as you're able to go for a combo that doesn't actually activate Branded Fusion at all, and instead goes for Verte Anaconda. The reason you can do this is because the card can search for Kit, which is able to special summon itself since High Spirits also puts an Albaz fusion into the graveyard. From there, all you need is any monster to normal summon, and you can then link into Anaconda. You don't have this option with the other cards that special summon, like Opening or Deployment, since those cards lock you into only summoning fusion monsters from the extra deck. Whenever you draw this card, you should always consider how you can use it to play around Ash Blossom. This card pairs best with Albaz or Serenir, since they are dragons, which means you can send Albion or Titaniclad to the graveyard. These are also the best discards for this card, since they have the most value in the graveyard. Typically you'll use this to search for Kit, but it's also pretty strong to search for Quem after you discard a Serenir. The Serenir can send Retribution to the graveyard, and the Quem can then send Branded Fusion. This is a nice way to start a regular Branded Fusion combo, since it puts Quem onto the board before going for the Branded Fusion. The biggest downside to High Spirits is that it's pretty weak into Max C. Branded doesn't like being hit with Max C in general, but it's usually not the end of the world when you can just summon Sanctifier, giving the opponent a single draw. However, in the High Spirit combos, you typically try to special summon Kit from your hand, which is an activated effect, and so the opponent can chain Max C for a draw. Another downside to High Spirits is that it's not amazing at going second, since it requires a discard, and a lot of its value doesn't happen until the end phase. Like most branded cards, High Spirits also has a graveyard effect. During the end phase, if a fusion monster was sent to your graveyard that turn, you can add the High Spirits back to your hand. You can only use one effect per turn though, not both. This means that you cannot add it back to your hand in your end phase, and then immediately use the search effect right after. This effect to recycle itself is good for keeping resources in longer games. It's a good discard with Albaz on the opponent's turn, since it'll just come right back to your hand in the end phase. Another big downside to High Spirits is that it requires another card to function. If you don't draw any monster to discard, the High Spirits won't be able to do anything. I've personally had a lot of success with branded lists that don't include High Spirits. Also, in 40 cards versions, you don't need as many starter cards for the deck to be consistent, and so High Spirits sometimes gets left out of the deck. Overall though, I think High Spirits is a worthwhile inclusion, especially in builds that go over 40 cards. The ability to play against Ash Blossom is super valuable, and I'd recommend not cutting this card. Next is Branded in Red. This card lets you target a Despia monster in your graveyard, or a Fallen of Albaz, and add it to your hand. You can then fusion summon a level 8 or higher monster by banishing the materials from your hand or field. You typically use this to summon Guardian Chimera on the opponent's turn, which then destroys 1 or 2 cards, as well as generating follow-up by drawing cards, triggering Branded Lost, and maybe even triggering Tragedy too. But you can also use this to summon any Albaz fusion, provided that you have the materials. It's worth noting that you don't need to use the monster that you add back with this card for the fusion summon, so you can sometimes summon Albaz fusions even when you only have Despias to add back. Branded in Red is important to play because it's one of the main cards that you want to set with Albion at the end of your combo. In my opinion, Banishment is slightly better, but only slightly. Whenever you get a chance to search for something extra in addition to Banishment, it's usually Branded in Red. There's also some combos that require the use of Branded in Red on the first turn too, especially if you play the Puppet Lock. And similarly, some combos only put Albaz into the graveyard, which is not a target for Banishment, but can be targeted with Branded in Red. Another really important quality that Branded in Red has is that it gives your end board an easy way to deal with back row decks. Most branded end boards are easily strong enough to win against combo or mid-range decks, but back row decks can be harder to deal with, since a lot of Branded's disruptions are just different ways to clear the opponent's monsters. Setting 5 trap cards is a good way to invalidate cards like Mirror Jade, Banishment, and Mercourier, since they can't do anything to get rid of back row. This is where Branded in Red is really helpful, as it can summon out Chimera to destroy 2 cards, which allows you to start sniping the back row before the opponent can use them in response. When you draw Branded in Red in your opening hand, you can also sometimes use it to play around Imperm on Allure or Albion. You do this by putting Albaz or Tragedy into the graveyard first, so that you can chain the Branded in Red in response to the Imperm to remove whatever the opponent targets from the field. In the past, I've often not included Branded in Red in my deck. The reason is because I didn't want to play so many search targets in the same deck, since it increases the chances of bricking. But going over 40 cards allows the deck to play more search targets, because you won't end up drawing them as often. One other thing to keep in mind about Branded in Red is that the monster you summon it can't actually attack directly that turn. So when you use this card going second, make sure to remember that you should use the monster you summon with it to attack over an opponent's monster, since it wouldn't be able to deal any damage otherwise. Then we have Branded Banishment. This card can target a Despia monster, or a level 8 or higher fusion monster in your graveyard, and special summon it. You can then fusion summon any level 8 or higher fusion monster by banishing materials from either player's field. Banishment is the primary target for Albion to set during the end phase. I've always preferred setting Banishment over Branded in Red, because Banishment is a more reliable card overall. Branded in Red requires you to use other monsters from your hand and field to make best use of the card, whereas Banishment usually works well completely on its own. Typically you'll use Banishment to summon back Albion, and then fuse that Albion with the opponent's dark monster to summon Dragostopelia. You'll also frequently use Banishment as a way to revive Mirror Jade, or something like Furious Dragon, after the opponent removes it. A lot of end boards can also use Banishment just to fuse your own board into Dragostopelia. This is useful as it can allow you to resolve something like Sanctifier, Mirror Jade, or even Max C, without giving the opponent a chance to respond due to Branded Lost. This is especially important if you're playing the Puppet Lock. It's these practical uses for Banishment that makes the card more appealing to me than Branded in Red. Additionally, there are matchups where Banishment is exceptionally strong, like Dragon Link, Tearlaments, and the Mirror match. The Branded Mirror match usually revolves around Banishment, as the card can swing an entire game by itself when it resolves. Remember that you can only revive extra deck monsters if they were already properly summoned. So make sure you don't make the mistake of trying to summon an Albion that was sent to the graveyard with Mirror Jade or High Spirits. Sometimes you'll see Branded decks that don't play Banishment. I think this is a huge mistake, as Banishment is in my opinion one of the most useful cards in the deck. The card is extremely searchable though, so you should only ever play one copy, even in the matchups where the card is really good. Next up is Brightest Blazing Branded King. This card negates the effects of all face-up cards on the field until the end of the turn, except for one Albaz fusion you control. This card is basically just a negate for any one card, but sometimes has applications for negating multiple cards at the same time. You will typically use this to negate cards like Chaos Angel, Runic Fountain, Kashtira Birth, and an opponent's Branded Fusion. It can even be used to negate evenly matched too, although you don't usually have Branded King on the end board. The reason this card is included in the deck is to have an answer to a problematic floodgate like Rivalry, Skill Drain, or Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. That last example is a particularly powerful floodgate against Branded that would be impossible to out without Branded King in the deck. It's also a great way to play around Bestials, since Banishment and Branded in Red can both be stopped by a Bestial, and so setting Branded King instead allows you to have a disruption for the opponent's turn that can't be stopped by a Bestial. This might come up when the opponent uses Magnamut for example, since you know they'll be able to search a Bestial in the end phase. Branded King also has a second effect in the graveyard. During the end phase, if a fusion monster was sent to your graveyard that turn, you can add this card back to your hand, although you can only use one effect per turn. This second effect is very similar to High Spirits. You mainly use the card for its effect on the field, but sometimes the recursion can be useful to make sure you have a discard for Albaz. Branded King is not mandatory in the deck, and I wouldn't be opposed to cutting it. A lot of lists choose not to play it, and I think it makes a lot of sense that they don't. 60 card versions will usually play it, since they don't have to worry as much about drawing the search targets and bricking, but for smaller lists, Branded King might not be essential enough to make it into the deck. I still like it though, just to make sure I don't lose to floodgates. Fusion Duplication is next. This card can target a normal or quick play spell with fusion in its name in either graveyard, banish it, and then copy the effect. This is the card you want to set with Thrust after you get ashed on Branded Fusion, as it can copy the Branded Fusion during the opponent's turn to summon something like Albion or Sanctifier. After you use this on your own branded fusion, the branded fusion will get banished, so the only way to get it back after that is with Kit's effect. It's also worth noting that this card can also copy Super Poly and Fusion Deployment too. Keep in mind that when you copy Super Poly, you don't have to discard a card, and the opponent can also still respond, since duplication only copies the effect of the card, not any costs or conditions attached to it. Copying Deployment allows you to summon Albaz on the opponent's turn, which is a play that will probably catch a lot of opponents off guard. But of course, the main reason to use this is to copy branded fusion. I think that playing cards that allow you to beat Ash Blossom is really strong in this deck, so duplication, along with some number of thrusts, is close to mandatory in my opinion. Although you could make the argument that some 40 card lists don't have the space for it. Duplication is also exceptionally strong when you're still able to make a board through a hand trap. Since resolving branded fusion again is a great way to cover weaknesses in your end board, as well as provide further disruption. One thing to note about this card is that it can also target cards in the opponent's graveyard. So in the mirror match, you can actually banish their branded fusion and then resolve it yourself, which is a hugely powerful play, especially if you chain it when they try to add the branded fusion back to hand with retribution. Fusion duplication is a pretty bad draw going second, but it's actually a little better than some of the other branded bricks, like Banishment or Branded King. Overall, I don't think there's much reason not to play this card. The only argument that I think has any merit is that you don't have enough space in the deck for thrust. Currently though, I think this should be in the deck. And then the last card in the main deck is Branded Retribution. This card can negate a spell card, trap card, or monster effect that includes an effect to special summon a monster by shuffling 2 Albaz fusions from the graveyard back into the extra deck, or by shuffling 1 Albaz fusion from the field instead. It also has a second effect while in the graveyard. You can banish it from the graveyard to add back another branded spell or trap from your graveyard to your hand. Retribution's graveyard effect is used in almost every single combo. You'll use it to add back branded in white, or branded in red, for a lot of combos, but very often you'll also use it as a way to access branded fusion in the first place. When you don't need this card for your turn 1 combo, you'll usually still end up using it anyway, as a means of getting an extra disruption, or on your next turn to recycle branded fusion. Retribution also helps going second, as it can put a card back into your hand to help offset a problem that branded sometimes has when going second, which is that too many of your effects require discards. Retribution can also be used to play well into activation negations, like Baron, Judgment, and Savage Dragon, by adding back branded fusion after it's been negated, so that you can try and use it again right away. The on-field effect of Retribution isn't used very often, but setting this card with Albion is occasionally a useful play, particularly in the mirror match as a way to set up a negate for the opponent's banishment. Setting this card also stops Bestials from being effective against your own banishment, and because it's a counter trap, it doesn't matter if the opponent drew more than 1 Bestial either. This card is mandatory, as the deck is just better with this card. It can be an awkward card to draw, since it's not a starter or extender, but to be honest, the reason it's awkward is usually just because it's no longer in the deck for cards like Shrouded Dragon and Serenir. There are a lot of ways to discard Retribution out of your hand, and when you do, it's the best discard in the deck, since it has value in the graveyard immediately. A lot of 60 card lists prefer to play 2 of this, and it makes a lot of sense why. Having a second copy in the deck means that the awkwardness of drawing it no longer exists, since there's another copy in the deck anyway. Drawing the card in combination with a way to discard it would actually turn the card into a good draw, as it can be used for its value in the graveyard. 2 Retribution also means that you're more likely to mill it with grass, and it of course also means you get to have 2 uses of the recycle effect. That being said, putting another dead draw into the deck is a big deal, even in 60 cards. I'm not 100% sure that I'd like to be playing more than 1 Retribution in a 60 card build, and in a build that has less than 60 cards, I think it's completely out of the question. The best amount of Retribution to play is 1 copy. The first card in the extra deck is Predaplant Dragostopelia. Its materials are 1 fusion monster and any dark monster. Once per turn, the card can target an opponent's monster and put a Predaplant counter on it, which makes that monster become level 1. It then continuously negates the activated effects of all monsters with those Predaplant counters. It's important to realize that this card only negates activated effects, not continuous ones. And it also only negates while the Dragostopelia is on the field. On the other hand though, the counters it puts onto monster will remain there even when the Dragostopelia leaves the field, and those monsters will therefore still be level 1 as well. The main reason this card is here is because it's the easiest monster to fusion summon with banishment. Remember that the usual target for banishment is Albion, which is a fusion monster, so all the opponent needs to do to allow you to summon Dragostopelia is summon a single dark monster. This card is also another disruption after you summon it, which makes it more reliable, even though it's not amazingly strong. Dragostopelia is really important against Kashtira, since it can negate both effects of Fenrir at the same time and then also make it level 1, so that it can't be used as XYZ material. Dragostopelia is bigger than most cash monsters, preventing them from just attacking over it before searching, and it's also one of the only good monsters to summon on your first turn when the opponent uses Dimension Shifter, which is also very popular in Kashtira. Against Tearlaments, or the Mirror Match, Dragostopelia can be a good super poly target too. Since the extra deck is very tight and branded, you might consider cutting this card, even though it gets used a lot. However, I think Dragostopelia is slightly too important to cut. The Sprint, the Proskenion, and even the Anaconda are all more likely to get cut before the Dragostopelia. Next is Borlode Furious Dragon. This card requires 2 Dark Dragon monsters as material, and it has a quick effect to target a monster you control, as well as any card the opponent controls, and then destroy them. It's worth noting that this card can also target itself, so you don't need another monster necessarily. This card can destroy spell and trap cards, which is the main reason that it's so useful in the deck. Guardian Chimera can also destroy back row, but it's not always as simple to summon Chimera as it is to summon Furious Dragon, especially when you go second. When you get to go first, Chimera is still the best way to set up back row removal, but for going second, Furious Dragon is a more practical way to do it. Furious Dragon can easily be summoned with Albion, Lubellion, or branded in white, which is much easier to have access to than branded in red, as well as a target in the graveyard, and also the 2 other monsters required for Chimera. Furious Dragon also does a better job at dealing with specific floodgates, like Grave of the Super Ancient Organism or Skill Drain, since it can chain its effect directly to the floodgate, whereas Chimera cannot. You typically summon Furious Dragon with Albaz and Abyssal, or Albaz and Albion, or sometimes even 2 Albaz. If you summon it using Lubellion, it can be a good way to put 2 of your banished Albaz back into the deck, and Lubellion is then also a free monster on the board that you can use with the Furious Dragon's effect. The card works really well alongside Opening, since you can protect your own fusion monsters from being destroyed, allowing you to get multiple uses out of Furious without needing other monsters to destroy. Another important use for Furious Dragon is that it can just be summoned alongside Mirror Jade as another huge monster that has a disruptive effect. This matters because you can only control 1 Mirror Jade, so you often find yourself in a position where you need another strong boss monster to put your resources into. Furious Dragon is important against Kashtira, since it can be used to destroy Kashtira Birth, and it's also pretty crucial in the Mirror Match in combination with Branded Lost, to destroy the opponent's set banishment at a time where it can't be chained. A similar play comes up often against Runic Fountain too. Also, just like Dragostopelia, Furious Dragon is a good monster to summon instead of Mirror Jade when the opponent uses Shifter. There's actually a second effect on Furious Dragon, but it's almost never going to matter. You can banish it from the graveyard to summon a Dark Link monster from your graveyard. This can technically summon back Anaconda, but you'll probably never actually use that effect. Overall, I think that Furious Dragon is mandatory in the deck, as having access to the easy spell and trap removal is just too important. Titaniclad the Ash Dragon is next. This is an Albaz fusion that requires Albaz and any monster with 2,500 or more attack as material. It gains attack equal to the total levels of the monsters used to summon it times 100. Also, after its fusion summoned, it's unaffected by the activated effects of any monster special summoned from the extra deck until the end of the turn. This card is typically 3,700 attack when you summon it, since it's probably being summoned with Albaz and Lubellion, or Albaz and a fusion monster. This can be a good way to attack over something threatening, since the Titaniclad's ability to be unaffected also makes it difficult to remove. However, the main way to use this card is for its graveyard effect, not its effect on the field. During the end phase, if it was sent to the graveyard that turn, you can summon or search an Albaz or Dogmatica monster from your deck. Remember that Quem is always treated as a Dogmatica monster, and so this is how most combos want to access Quem. You will typically get this in the graveyard through the effect of Gran Winyal, but also sometimes Mirror Jade's effect too. Occasionally you might also send this to the graveyard with High Spirits, since it is a dragon, so it works with the usual good cards to pair High Spirits with. You can also use Titaniclad in the opponent's end phase to summon Albaz, which can then fuse with a monster on their board. This card is super important in branded combos, so I'd say it's pretty close to mandatory in the deck. One rare use of Titaniclad to keep in mind is that it can be tribute to summon Lubellion, since it's a level 8 Dark Dragon monster. This is a potential option during a long grind game when both copies of Albion have already been used. Next is Sprint the Iron Dash Dragon. This is another Albaz fusion that requires Albaz and any effect monster that was special summoned that turn. During the main phase, you can move Sprint to another main monster zone, and then destroy all other face-up cards in the column that it's now in. This is unfortunately not a quick effect, so you can't use this as a disruption on the opponent's turn, but you can sometimes still use this on your own turn as a way to clear monsters and push for lethal. You can even use this effect to destroy certain continuous spell and trap cards, like Gozen Match, Kashtira Birth, or the super heavy Samurai Pendulum Scales. Most of the time though, you only ever summon this card because it's the only possible fusion to make when you fuse Albaz with an opponent's monster. This is pretty common against Kashtira, since none of their monsters are light or dark, and you typically want to remove the main deck monsters, instead of waiting for them to summon from the extra deck, which means that you can't fuse into Mirror Jade either. Sprint can also be a way to deal with Contact C, which isn't a very popular card, but it does sometimes see play in Labyrinth. Similarly to Titaniclad though, the main use of Sprint is actually its graveyard effect. During the end phase, if it was sent to the graveyard that turn, you can take a Springans monster from your deck, or a copy of Albaz, and then either summon it, or add it to your hand. The typical use for this is to send Sprint with Mirror Jade's effect, so that you can search for Kit during the opponent's end phase, which then allows you to add back branded fusion on your next turn. I also really like having a fusion in my extra deck that can summon Albaz in the opponent's end phase, besides Titaniclad. This means that even when I use Titaniclad for my combos on turn 1, I still have the option of summoning Albaz from the deck in the opponent's end phase. That being said, adding back branded fusion with Kit is actually not essential, as the deck usually generates enough advantage and follow-up that it doesn't even need to resolve branded fusion a second time. Also, with Kashtira being the only matchup where Sprint typically gets summoned, it's very understandable to cut this card for other options. Personally, I think that always having the option to send something with Mirror Jade that can summon Albaz in the end phase is enough to make me keep this card. You could easily swap this for something like Mud Dragon though. Next up is Albion the Branded Dragon, which requires Albaz and a light monster as material. When it's fusion summoned, it can fusion summon a level 8 or lower fusion monster by banishing materials from your hand, field, or graveyard. Also, during the end phase, if this card is in the graveyard because it was sent there that turn, you can set a branded spell or trap from your deck, or add it to your hand instead. This is the monster that you summon with branded fusion the most, regardless of whether you're going first or second. Most combos will summon this by sending the Bestial Lubellion to the graveyard, which will then later tribute the Albion to summon itself to the field. This allows you to get the Albion into the graveyard so that it can trigger during the end phase, while also setting it up as the target for banishment. Albion typically summons Lubellion in most combos, which then triggers to summon Mirror Jade, but it can also summon out Furious Dragon, or sometimes Mirror Jade directly. It's very common to use both copies of Albion over the course of a game, so you should always be playing 2, even though the extra deck is very tight. You don't need to play 3, but you definitely can't get away with playing just 1. And then there's Mirror Jade the Iceblade Dragon. This card is the main boss monster of Branded. It's the strongest card in the extra deck by far, and you're always trying to have it on your end board above all else. Its materials are 1 Albaz, plus a fusion, synchro, XYZ, or link monster. And you can only control 1 Mirror Jade at a time. This card has a quick effect to banish any monster on the field by sending an Albaz fusion from the extra deck to the graveyard as cost. This effect is a soft once per turn, so you can easily get multiple banishes in the same turn by removing Mirror Jade from the field and then summoning it again. The banishing effect also says that you can't use it again on the following turn after you use it, but this is easily worked around since it only applies to that 1 copy of Mirror Jade. All you have to do is remove the Mirror Jade from the field and then summon it again. You typically do this with cards like Cartesia or Banishment, but you can also just wait for the opponent to remove the Mirror Jade for you, and then summon out another one. Mirror Jade also has another effect. If it leaves the field because of an opponent's card, you can destroy all monsters they control during the end phase. This effect triggers at the time the Mirror Jade leaves the field and does not activate again during the end phase, which means it gets around a lot of cards that are immune to activated effects, like Chaos Angel, Expertly Noir, and Psychic End Punisher. This effect will trigger when Mirror Jade is destroyed by battle, and even when it's tribute for something like Lava Golem, a Kaiju, or the continuous effect of Rika Con. Since the Albaz fusions all also generate some kind of follow-up in the end phase, Mirror Jade is capable of winning an entire game by itself. The best Albaz fusion to send with Mirror Jade is actually Rindbrum, since it doesn't need to wait until the end phase to get value. With Rindbrum in the graveyard, you can revive a copy of Albaz at any time during the opponent's turn, which will then let you fuse away their monsters. This means that as long as there's a copy of Albaz in the graveyard, Mirror Jade represents 2 disruptions, not just 1. Since the end phase effect of Mirror Jade is also difficult for a lot of decks to deal with, it's easy to see why Mirror Jade is the most important card on the end board. You'll typically summon this with Albion or Lubellion, but a lot of combos actually summon it with Branded in White, and there's a lot of times where you end up making Mirror Jade with the opponent's monsters through the effect of Albaz too. One important thing to know about Mirror Jade is how it interacts with having its effect negated. Since the part that locks you out of using it again on the following turn is actually part of the effect, it means that if Mirror Jade gets negated before it can banish a monster, then you'll still be able to use its effect again next turn. This is pretty good to know, as it makes Imperm a suspicious card to use against it, and a lot of combos actually negate your own Mirror Jade using Rindbrum on the first turn. Mirror Jade is honestly one of the best boss monsters in the entire game, since it just does everything you want a deck to do, but in a single card. Next is Lubellion the Searing Dragon. This is an Albaz fusion that requires Albaz and a dark monster as material. When it's fusion summoned, you can discard a card to fusion summon a level 8 or lower fusion monster by shuffling cards from your field, graveyard, and banished cards into the deck as material. Afterwards, Lubellion can't attack for the rest of the turn. The way you normally use Lubellion is to summon it with Albion's effect, and then use its effect to summon Mirror Jade using itself as material. You don't summon it with Branded Fusion directly very often, since it's almost always stronger to go for Albion instead. However, summoning Lubellion with Branded Fusion is a good way to play around Bestials and DD Crow, and you might also want to do this going second to play around a set copy of Called by the Grave. If you do summon Lubellion with Branded Fusion, the dark monster that you typically want to send to the graveyard is Tragedy, in order to search for a Despia, but you can also send Serenir to get a spell or trap into the graveyard. Another interesting option is to send 2 copies of Albaz, so that you can keep one in the graveyard for effects like Rindbrum, Quem, or Branded in Red, and then use the other one to summon Mirror Jade. It's pretty important to have access to Lubellion, but it usually shuffles itself back into the extra deck for its own effect, so you only need to play the 1 copy. Then we have Gran Winyal the Dusk Dragon. This is not an Albaz fusion, instead it's a Cartesia fusion. Its materials are Blazing Cartesia the Virtuous, and any light or dark monster. When it's fusion summoned, you can send a light or dark monster that is level 6 or higher from your deck or extra deck to the graveyard. You typically use this to send Titaniclad to get to Quem during the end phase, or you can send Serenir to put Retribution into the graveyard. If you've already used the Serenir that turn, you can send Shrouded Dragon instead, so that you can then send whichever spell or trap you want to add back with the Retribution. If you're playing the Puppet Lock, then this is how you're gonna get it to the graveyard most of the time. The Gran Winyal is also a light spellcaster, which means it can then be used as material for Sanctifier, which is how you summon the puppet to the opponent's field. You summon this card a lot using Cartesia on your first turn, particularly when you draw fusion deployment. Gran Winyal also has another effect. If the opponent special summons a monster using a monster effect, you can banish the Gran Winyal from your field or graveyard, and then summon either a Dogmatica monster from your deck, or a Despia monster from your extra deck. This trigger is a lot less situational than it sounds, since most decks in the game will naturally trigger it eventually. Some examples of cards that commonly end up triggering Gran Winyal are Rise Heart, Heavy Borger, Lady Labyrinth, Visa's Starfrost, Albion and Lubellion, Scarecrow, the Tearlament monsters, as well as any Bestial and Nibiru. Those last 2 examples are especially important, as they will lessen the impact of those hand traps. The best target to summon with this effect by far is Quem, since Quem is able to provide disruption on the opponent's turn, as well as being a great card to have for extension and follow-up. If you can summon Quem with this, you probably should, but it is very common to already have Quem by the time the Grand Wignol triggers, and so it's nice to have an additional target that you can summon as well. Since this effect is not an essential part of the game plan for Branded, you definitely don't want to be including a secondary target in the main deck, since it would just be a waste of space, and not worth the amount of times that you draw it. So instead, the secondary target should be in the extra deck. In this case, I'm playing Proskenion, but it could also be Quiritis or Luluwallalith as well. My reason for preferring Proskenion over the other two is that Proskenion provides the most value in the mirror match, since its effect on the field can be very powerful, and it also acts as a strong option to summon with Super Poly or Banishment. Proskenion does require the right matchups in order to be better than Quiritis and Luluwallalith though, so the right target to play for Grand Wignol is pretty dependent on the format. In truth, a secondary target for Grand Wignol is not actually needed in the deck at all, as it's often just an addition to an already strong board. So you can make a good argument that the Proskenion could be cut for something more important, like Mud Dragon or Garura. As for the Grand Wignol itself though, it goes without saying that you play this card, and you should only play the one copy. Technically everything in the extra deck can be recycled using Lubellion anyway, so you can always shuffle this card back into the extra deck if you desperately needed to use it again. Next is Rindbrum, the Striking Dragon. This is another Albaz fusion, and this one's requirements are Albaz plus any beast, beast warrior, or winged beast monster. While it's on the field, when a fusion, synchro, XYZ, or link monster activates an effect, Rindbrum can negate the effect, and then optionally return any monster on the field to the hand. This effect plays an important role in some combos, as it is used to negate your own Mirror Jade, in order to put an Albaz fusion in the graveyard for free. This effect can also be used as a regular disruption against the opponent's extra deck monsters, but using it like that can be unreliable, since some decks don't need to use their extra deck right away, like Labyrinth, Vanquish Soul, or Kashtira, and will therefore have no trouble dealing with the Rindbrum. Rindbrum is also not as good as it sounds in the mirror match either, since Branded Lost usually prevents you from being able to use the Rindbrum in a meaningful way. This card is however a very solid disruption against Super Heavy Samurai, as well as Manadium. You'll typically summon Rindbrum with Branded Fusion when you're going for a combo with a Bestial. The Rindbrum can be summoned using Mare Courier, which can be banished by the Bestial, which will then trigger to get a search. It's important to realize that Rindbrum can only use its effect directly in response to the effect it is trying to negate, which means that the opponent has some potential counterplay by ordering their triggers correctly. This actually prevents Rindbrum from being good in a few matchups that it would be otherwise, like Tearlaments and Dragon Link, since they can use important cards like Kitkalos and Striker Dragon as Chain Link 1, and then something else as Chain Link 2. It's also worth noting that you can return any monster on the field to the hand, not just the monster you negate, so sometimes you're able to trade with two of the opponent's cards using just the Rindbrum. And this can be useful for returning your own monsters for follow-up, like Kit, Aluber, or the Bestial Lubellion. Rindbrum also has a graveyard effect, and it's generally the effect that you will use more often. While it's in the graveyard, as a quick effect during the opponent's turn, you can banish it to special summon an Albaz from your graveyard. Alternatively, you can also banish the Albaz to special summon the Rindbrum instead. This effect is almost always used to summon Albaz, since it's a lot stronger to fuse away the opponent's monster than it is to just summon back Rindbrum. Also, the usual way to get Rindbrum into the graveyard is through Mirror Jade's effect, which means you don't have the option of summoning the Rindbrum, since it wasn't fusion summoned first. Rindbrum is crucial for giving your end boards extra power and reliability, so this card is mandatory. I also like the idea of playing two Rindbrum, as it would give the option of always sending it to the graveyard with Mirror Jade, even when you go for a combo that ends with Rindbrum on the field. Then there's Albion the Sanctifier Dragon. This card requires Albaz and a light spellcaster monster as material. The opponent cannot target it with card effects, and it also cannot be used as fusion material. During the opponent's turn, Sanctifier has the effect to target two monsters among either graveyard, and then summon one to each side of the field. This is how you achieve the puppet lock if you're playing it, but it's also an incredibly good card without using the puppet too. You can use this to summon Albaz to your field, and then fuse with the opponent's monster. If the opponent doesn't have a good monster to fuse with, you can use this to put one on their field anyway. Sometimes you can even use this to disrupt an effect that targets a card in the opponent's graveyard, like Scarecrow, branded in red, or Scareclaw Rival, by summoning their target to your side of the field. The fact that this card can't be targeted by the opponent's card effects makes it immune to Imperm, as well as certain important removal effects like Big Welcome Labyrinth and Runic Flashing Fire. This card theoretically also plays pretty well into Dimensional Barrier, since it can be summoned in response using Cartesia, and you can then use it to play during the opponent's turn instead. When the opponent chains Max C to your branded fusion, Sanctifier is the monster that you usually want to summon, since it will only give them a single draw, and it has the potential to make strong disruptive plays on its own. Sanctifier has a graveyard effect too, but it's very unlikely that you'll ever actually resolve this. You can tribute 2 monsters from the extra monster zones, as well as 2 monsters from each player's central main monster zone, and then special summon Sanctifier from the graveyard. This is not something you should ever expect to use, especially because the opponent can't easily play around it. However, I would be shocked if any of my opponents actually respected this effect though, since it's very likely that they don't even know it exists. Overall, this card is pretty obviously strong, and you will use it all the time. Next is Guardian Chimera. When this card is fusion summoned by a spell effect, it can draw cards equal to the number of monsters used as material from the hand, and then destroy cards on the opponent's field equal to the number of monsters used as material from the field. This card requires 3 monsters with different names as material, but also can only be made using monsters from your hand and field, and must use at least 1 from each. This means that this card cannot be summoned with Super Poly, Banishment, or by banishing monsters from the graveyard with branded in white. Since it's level 9, it also cannot be summoned with Albion or Lubellion either. This means that the only way to summon this card is with branded in red, or branded in white by using only monsters in your hand and field. It can technically be summoned with Cartesia's effect too, but since Chimera needs to be summoned with a spell in order to get its effect, you don't ever want to actually summon it this way. Chimera is a crucial part of the deck's game plan against back row decks, since you can destroy 2 of their set cards during the end phase, but it also frequently gets summoned against other kind of decks too, since the option is always there whenever you have branded in red on your end board. Typically, you'll use branded in red to add back Aluber or Albaz, and then banish it alongside 2 other monsters from your field to summon out Chimera. This allows you to draw 1 card, then destroy 2 cards on the opponent's field. This can come up when you need to destroy a spell or trap card, like Runic Fountain, or Branded Lost, but there's usually better ways to disrupt the opponent when you're only dealing with monsters. When you go first, I don't recommend you use Chimera to draw 2 cards on the opponent's turn very often, since the monsters you have in hand at the end of your turn are likely going to be better for follow-up than random draws. Also, Chimera is not really a strong disruption when it's only destroying 1 card, so it's better to destroy 2 cards instead, and then keep more follow-up in hand. When you go second, Chimera usually gets summoned as a way of pushing through the opponent's disruptions, as you can use branded in red to dodge cards like Imperm, and then use Chimera's effect to force through more of their disruptions. After summoning Guardian Chimera, it's pretty common to have other triggers you can activate, like Tragedy, Mercourier, Branded Lost, or Quem, so you want to make sure that you order the chain links correctly. Since Chimera's effect draws cards, it's possible to negate it with Ash, which means you usually want something else as the highest chain link. It's also good to resolve search effects that have only 1 target in the deck before drawing cards, just in case you draw the card that you were going to search for anyway. Guardian Chimera also has a continuous effect that makes it untargetable while polymerization is in the graveyard, but since we're not playing Poly, this effect doesn't matter at all. Overall, I think that Chimera is a pretty overrated card, but I still like playing it just to cover bad matchups like Labyrinth and Stun. Branded in red can summon other monsters besides Chimera, which is why I think it's not unreasonable to cut Chimera from the extra deck. Currently, I think it's still worth playing though, since having the option against Labyrinth is enough to make me keep it. Then we have Despian Proskenion. This card requires 1 Despia monster, 1 light monster, and 1 dark monster as material. During the main phase, as a quick effect, this card can target a fusion, synchro, XYZ, or link monster in the opponent's graveyard, and then either summon it to your field, or banish it. It also has the effect to inflict damage to the opponent equal to the attack or defense of any monster that it destroys by battle. This card is here mainly to be a target for Gran Winyal, but it also has pretty good application in the mirror match, as well as against Dragon Link and Sword Soul. Having this card as an option for going second in general though is also pretty nice. Since it always does 3,200 damage when it attacks over an attack position monster, it's pretty easy to get in lethal damage using this card. While going second, you can summon this with Branded in White, or Cartesia, or even Grand Wignol after the opponent triggers its second effect. It's a target for Super Poly and Banishment in the mirror match, as well as against Pearly, and it can sometimes be an extra disruption to add onto your end board against certain decks. Mathmech, for example, can struggle against Proskenion since it can steal the update Jammer out of the graveyard, preventing the opponent from being able to end the game that turn. This card is usually very clutch when it comes up, but since it's not part of the main game plan for Branded, it's still one of the least important cards in the extra deck, and cutting it is completely understandable. You could play Quiritis instead since that's also a target for Grand Wignol, but out of the two of them, Proskenion is probably the better one. There's also Lulya-Walleth, which has the advantage of being a genuinely reliable disruption when summoned. However, I personally like Proskenion the most, because of its applications going second, as well as for getting the edge in the mirror match. And then the last card in the extra deck is Predaplant Verte Anaconda. Anaconda is super important in Branded, as it allows you to play around Ash in a lot of hands. Branded in High Spirits in particular has a lot of lines that use Anaconda instead of activating Branded Fusion. The way you use Anaconda in this deck is to copy Branded Fusion with its effect, and then summon Mirror Jade using itself and an Albaz from the deck as material. After using Anaconda, you can't special summon monsters for the rest of the turn, which is why you always have to make Mirror Jade directly. Alternatively, you could also summon Sanctifier instead, but it's usually a lot safer to just go for the Mirror Jade. Branded Fusion is the main card you send with Anaconda, but you also sometimes send Super Poly, and can technically send Deployment too. Anaconda also has the effect to target a monster on the field, and make it into a dark monster for the rest of the turn. In theory, this effect matters, since Branded fuses with the opponent's monsters all the time, and so their attribute is important, but in practice you won't use this very often. Anaconda usually only gets summoned on the first turn, or as a way to resolve Super Poly during a grind game. Playing around Ash is super important in Branded, and so I think cutting Anaconda is out of the question. So now that we've gone over every card in the deck, I want to go through some of the things that I'm not playing in this list. The most obvious card that is absent from my deck here is probably Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. This card locks the opponent out of special summoning for their entire turn by being summoned to their field with Sanctifier. It doesn't activate to lock the opponent, it just applies its effect immediately after being summoned. This is the goal that a lot of Branded decks are going for right now, however I don't personally think it's the right way to go. Whenever Branded successfully combos, it's usually in a good position to win the game anyway, regardless of whether it ends on a Puppet Lock or not. Also, Puppet Lock combos aren't really any easier to get to than other powerful end boards, and so in practice, I think that the Puppet Lock isn't actually deciding the outcome of many games. Branded's biggest weakness is not in the power of its end board, it's in its inability to fit enough cards for going second into the deck, as well as not always being able to play through certain hand traps, and also sometimes bricking. Gimmick Puppet doesn't help compensate for any of these weaknesses, and in fact just makes it worse. This means that even though the card is an auto-win floodgate, it's actually also still just an unnecessary brick in the deck. On top of this, there are also matchups where the Gimmick Puppet does nothing. Labyrinth, for example, or Runic Stun, can easily just set some back row and not care at all about the fact that they can't special summon that turn. In contrast to this, a regular Branded end board could easily have the option of summoning Furious Dragon to destroy a back row, or Chimera during the opponent's end phase to destroy two. Puppet can also be vulnerable to a single well-timed Bestial, which most regular Branded combos don't lose to. There are a couple matchups where Puppet Lock is more attractive, like the Mirror Match or Kashtira, since those decks will sometimes be able to push through a regular board. However, it's still favored for you to win going first in these matchups, so I think that overall, the downsides of playing Puppet make the card not worth playing. You'll also notice that I'm not playing Ash Blossom in this current list. This is because Ash does not usually do enough going second to stop Super Heavy Samurai, Manadium, or Vanquish Soul by itself. Since Branded prefers playing a small amount of high-impact non-engine cards rather than a big amount of low-impact non-engine cards, it's likely that you'll draw Ash as your only hand trap too. There are some matchups where Ash becomes a high-impact card, like the Mirror Match, Labyrinth, and Runic decks, but I don't think it's enough to make me want to play a card that is bad in most other matchups. One other argument to play Ash is that it can negate max C when you go first. This is true, and you could consider side decking Ash in tournaments that have side decks, but in general it's not enough to make me want to play the card. I don't usually feel too threatened by max C, since passing turn on just Sanctifier can still potentially be strong, especially if you hard draw cards that can back it up, like Thrust for duplication, your non-engine cards, or any of the traps that Branded plays. I'm also therefore not playing Crossout, as it would be missing its most important target. There's no Beast plus Regained combo, since those cards don't typically have a role in most games of Branded. The usual game plan for Branded when it goes first is to build a huge board with a lot of disruptions and follow-up, so that you can then immediately win the game on turn 3. When Branded goes second, its game plan is to break through the opponent's board and push for lethal right away. In either case, you're not trying to play a slower grind game, which is what Beast and Regained primarily provide, since those cards are more focused on accumulating small incremental advantage over the course of multiple turns. That being said, not every game of Branded is actually decided on turn 2, so if you do play Beast and Regained, you'll definitely be appreciating them in longer games. In certain matchups, these cards can actually serve a very specific purpose too. For example, in the mirror match, using Beast to destroy Branded Lost in response to the opponent's Branded Fusion is a crucial play, as well as using it to destroy a set banishment after they search it and set it from their hand. Regained is also pretty nice in the mirror, since the games tend to be more back and forth, which allows Regained to generate a lot of value. Beast can also be used as a way to counter stun decks, since it can destroy Floodgates or potentially Runic Fountain. Overall though, most matchups don't require you to play Beast or Regained, and even the matchups that they're good in can easily be won without them. Additionally, Beast and Regained are both pretty bad draws, especially going second, and Branded is already playing a lot of suboptimal draws, so it's in your best interest to reduce the number of bricks where you can. Regained is a little bit better to draw than Beast, but it's still not close to being considered a good draw. It's worth mentioning again that Libellion almost always uses its effect to get Branded Lost, even in the matchups where Beast and Regained are good. For these reasons, I think it's better to exclude these cards from the deck. The reason there's no ad libitum of Despia in the deck is the same reason that there's no Gimmick Puppet. While ad lib allows for some very strong plays, it's usually used in positions that would be winning without it anyway. It's a bad draw, it doesn't help going second, and it takes up a slot in the deck list. Ad lib can be really good in the mirror, since it's always better to have more plays on the opponent's turn in that matchup, but it's not enough to make me want to put the card into the deck. Branded Sword is missing because it's not a good draw, and it's not at all essential for Branded to function. Sword is only used in very specific combos, or as a way to recycle certain engine pieces during a grind game. You might want this card to add back a banished Mercourier, for example, or an Albaz when all 3 copies are banished. But since this card is just another brick, I really don't recommend that you play it. 60 card versions typically like playing it because it's a good card to mill with grass, but other than that, there's not much merit to this card. There's no Magnamut in the deck, despite it being the best Bestial in the game overall. The reason for this is that Bestials are not very good as hand traps right now, which means you only play them because they are part of your engine. Serenir is of course the Bestial that helps with your combos, and then the Druisworm is only here because it's the best Bestial to search with Libellion for going second. When you're trying to break a board, it's more important to have a play that forces the opponent's disruptions than it is to get a free search during the end phase, which is why Druisworm works better than Magnamut. Magnamut is really good in the mirror match, as well as against Tearlaments and Labyrinth, but it doesn't do much against Super Heavy Samurai, Vanquish Soul, Kashtira, or Manadium. Bestials in general are very dependent on the format though, so whether or not it's good to play Magnamut will change pretty frequently. In formats where Bestials are actually good hand traps, then of course Magnamut is the best one, and you should play it in Branded. Masquerade the Blazing Dragon is something that is notably missing from the extra deck. The reason for this is very simply that there is not enough space for it. The card is really good as a potential target for Super Poly, and it's also pretty useful when you're going for an OTK, as it will tax the opponent when they try to use effects to keep themselves alive. In tournaments, Masquerade also helps you to win in time too, which is actually an important quality of the card. There are also some matchups where Masquerade's burn effect is too much for them to ignore, like Mathmech and Flu Wanderese. And the card is also an immediate auto-win against specifically Denomorphia. However, Masquerade's uses are slightly too situational, and all of the other cards in the extra deck currently are more important to have. I personally really like Masquerade, and I'll always play if I get the chance, but the optimal way to play Branded probably shouldn't include it. Nadir's Servant is another interesting card that I'm not playing in the deck. While Nadir's Servant is a good starter card, it's still worse than all of the other starters currently in the deck. Nadir has a hard time being useful going second, similar to High Spirits, since it doesn't get its full value until the end phase. It also locks you out of using the extra deck, which means you can't use the card as bait for breaking boards, as a skilled opponent will just allow it to resolve, since there's not a lot you can do in Branded without the extra deck. 60-card versions will usually play it, since they need the added consistency, but in smaller builds of Branded, the card is not essential. That being said, Nadir does provide a lot of extra value when you have it in addition to an already competent combo, and it has pretty good applications for playing through hand traps too. When going first, it's good to have Nadir in your deck instead of so much non-engine, as it will reduce the chance of bricking, as well as increasing your ability to play through hand traps. This is a potential option you could consider when playing tournaments with a side deck, or any other scenario where you can guarantee that you'll go first. Overall though, since Nadir is not good enough at going second, I prefer to leave it out of the deck. Dogmatica Maximus is an option Branded can sometimes play alongside Nadir's Servant, but since I'm not playing Nadir, there's not much point in playing the Maximus either. That being said, if I was to play Nadir, I would certainly include the Maximus, as it can allow for some strong plays using just one card. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Patchwork Engine. This hasn't seen much play in Branded for a while now, but some players do still like it. The Patchwork Engine has good application going second, since it allows you to easily summon Guardian Chimera, which is a very strong play to do when you haven't yet resolved Branded Fusion. Unfortunately though, the Patchwork Engine takes up way too many slots in the deck, even if you play the smallest package possible. This engine is pretty good in the mirror, especially alongside Ad Libitum and even Dramaturge too, but it ultimately takes up too much space, and so you're better off not playing it. It's good going second, but not as good as a hand trap or board breaker would be, which is what you'd need to cut to make room for this package in the deck. Now, I've mentioned 60-card versions a lot, and you might be wondering why I'm not playing a 60-card version myself. 60-card Branded is not inherently worse than smaller builds overall, it just has specific advantages and disadvantages. Here is my 60-card build of Branded. You can see it's playing all the same bricky search targets as my 49-card build, but with some additional ones too. There's Maximus for Nadir, Beast and Magnamut for Libellion, as well as evenly matched and Talents as search targets for Thrust. 60-card decks can get away with playing more bricks, since they're less likely to draw them in their opening hand. That's why this version is playing these 5 cards, while the smaller build is not. The advantage here is that the cards that search for these additional bricks become stronger draws, as they have more options available to them. Libellion is a better draw since it can search for 3 different bestials, instead of just 2, and its on-field effect is better since it can get Branded Beast, instead of just Branded Lost. Thrust becomes a better card going second, as it can search for evenly matched or talents to help break boards, instead of just the in-engine spell cards. And Thrust can also have better application going first too, as it can search for talents if the opponent uses hand traps that summon a monster to their board, like Nibru or Bestials. This version is also playing 3 copies of Nadir's Servant. This is mainly to make sure that the deck has enough starter cards, but it also acts as another way to help push through Ash Blossom, which is important since the chance of drawing the other cards that beat Ash is lower. Nadir's Servant is also the reason that the Proskenion has been swapped out for Lulu Walalith, as there are extra plays you can make with Nadir if you're also playing the Lulu. And then there's also the 1 copy of Grass too, which is worth playing since there are graveyard synergies in Branded. It's worth noting though that Grass is not as strong as this deck as it would be in other Grass decks, as the amount of powerful graveyard effects in Branded is pretty low comparatively. There's a good chance that you could mill 20 cards with Grass, and then only trigger a single Serenir. The best cards to mill with Grass are Tragedy, Albaz, Shrouded Dragon, Serenir, Retribution, and Opening. None of these cards are exceptionally strong when milled, and instead just provide a little bit of advantage and set up for future plays. It's still worth playing Grass though, since it will often bait Ash Blossom, and it is optionally searchable with Thrust. 60-card versions are generally better in the mirror match, as the optional search targets like Evenly and Talents can be used to break a board, and they'll probably resolve since Branded doesn't often set up negates. The increased amount of pistols works well since they are good hand traps against branded, and access to branded beast in order to destroy the opponent's branded lost is also really good. Playing 60 cards makes it harder for Runic to deck you out, and it also makes it less likely that your important surge targets like Branded Fusion will be banished off the top of your deck. Evenly matched, Talents, and Branded Beast will allow you to have more answers to stun decks, as well as Labyrinth, Kashtira, and Vanquish Soul. During a meta where those are the dominant decks, playing 60 cards is probably the better way to go. That being said, the major downside of playing 60 cards over a smaller build is that you will draw specific cards less often. The current meta requires you to draw either Duel, Max C, or Super Poly to have a chance going second against Super Heavy Samurai or Manadium. Since you're less likely to draw these cards in a 60-card deck, your matchup against those decks becomes worse. Also, when you go first against Super Heavy Samurai, drawing Duel is still really good, as it's a guaranteed way to stop them from playing. Since Super Heavy Samurai plays so many hand traps, there's a strong chance that they will be able to prevent you from making a good end board, which is why having a better chance of having Duel in your hand as a backup is a good idea. Pushing through hand traps is easier when you draw cards like Thrust and Call by the Grave, which is of course also less likely if you're playing a 60-card deck. In tournaments that have a side deck, 60-card versions will also struggle more than smaller builds, as your side deck cards will be less likely to be drawn. Overall, because both versions have different strengths and weaknesses, which have varying levels of relevance depending on the meta, it's impossible to say that one version is better than the other. 60-card decks allow you to cover more matchups, while smaller builds let you better target specific matchups. Which of these is more important will strongly depend on the meta, as well as the context in which you are playing. You could also play a 40-card build of Branded, with the aim of being as consistent as possible. This version aims to draw non-engine that can beat the combo decks as often as possible. It's also cutting a lot of the optional search targets like Druisworm, Branded King, and Duplication in order to reduce the amount of bricks in the deck. Without Thrust, this build plays harder into Ash Blossom, but it is also playing High Spirits as one of its main starter cards to help compensate for this. In general, I would say that you can play Branded with any amount of cards in the deck. You just need to make sure that the amount of bricks is proportional to the size of the deck. The more cards you play, the more optional search targets can be put into the deck. There's not much point playing 60 cards if your list has very few bricks, and it's also a bad idea to try and fit a lot of bricks into a 40-card list. So now that I've covered a lot of the deck theory, let's go through some of Branded Turn 1 combos. Before we get into the exact lines, there's something important you need to understand about Branded combos in general. Branded is a non-linear combo deck, which means its combos are not the exact same line every time. This isn't because there's any randomness involved in the card effects themselves, like with Pearly, Tearlaments, or any other deck that mills cards. Instead, it's because Branded plays a lot of engine cards and one of surge targets. These surge targets frequently show up in your opening hand and change what your optimal turn 1 end board would be, usually to your benefit. This is different to linear combo decks, like Mathmech, Sprite, or Super Heavy Samurai, where you will often see the same identical combo from them, step by step. So when you're learning these Branded combos, keep in mind that the pure line in the video is just a baseline, and you should try to use the other cards in your hand to improve on the end board. If you end up with a weaker board than the pure line despite using more cards to make it, you'll know that you probably messed something up at some point. And if you do manage to put up an extra disruption, or create more follow-up, you'll know that you probably played it well. It also helps a lot to have pure lines memorized, that way instead of spending time figuring out how to combo in the first place, you can spend all of your time thinking about how to best use your other cards to add onto your combo, as well as other important things, like how to play around hand traps, or how to abuse any matchup knowledge you might have. We'll go over some of the ideas you can look for on how to improve the pure lines as we go through each one, so don't worry about being left completely in the dark on that. But for now, let's look at the first combo. This first combo is with Fusion Deployment and Alober. Don't let the volcanic rats confuse you, their purpose is just to show you how much of your original 5-card hand gets used up over the course of the combo. This can be very important in evaluating a Branded end board, since many of your disruptions require a card in hand to discard, like Super Poly, or summoning Albaz on your opponent's turn. By summoning the Cartesia first, you're playing around impermanence, as well as effect Veiler, from targeting your Aluber, since you can easily chain Cartesia's quick effect to fuse away the Aluber if your opponent tries to use one of those cards. It's not an ideal situation to have to use the Cartesia so soon, but it's much better than letting Aluber be negated. The Mirror Jade should be in attack position, and up in the extra monster zone. The reason for this is that you want to avoid ending up in a situation where you don't have any free zones left for monsters you might summon on the opponent's turn. Monsters summoned from the graveyard by Quem, Banishment, or Sanctifier can only be summoned to the main monster zones, so you might as well take advantage of the extra zone while you can. The chain link order doesn't matter here since the opponent can't respond, just make sure you pay attention to which one is resolving first, since Albion the Shrouded Dragon is a valid target for both of these effects, which might catch you off guard if you aren't careful. It's worth noting that adding back Cartesia in the end phase is not always the right play in every line. It might seem completely free, but leaving the Cartesia in the graveyard allows you to summon it back with Quem, which does occasionally come up. Although most of the time, even if you want to summon the Cartesia, it can easily be discarded back into the graveyard again beforehand using something like an Albaz, or Super Polymerization. The end board here is a Mirror Jade Banish, a Mercurier Negate, a Banishment into Dragostopelia, and an Albaz in the graveyard that can be revived either with Quem's effect, or by sending Rindbrum to the graveyard with the Mirror Jade. In the case of using Rindbrum to revive Albaz, you can also use the Quem to get a second use out of a Mirror Jade that left the field, or for a Cartesia that was discarded for Albaz. Remember that when you fuse on the opponent's turn, you get another trigger of Branded Lost, which can search another Albaz, allowing the Cartesia you revive to fuse into Sanctifier, or Albion, which can then go into Borlode Furious Dragon. At any point, if your opponent triggers the Grand Winyal, you can also summon out Proskenion too. If everything goes according to plan, this board is 6 disruptions, potentially 7 depending on whether Albaz is able to fuse into a second Mirror Jade or not. And if you count Proskenion as a disruption, the number even goes up to 8. If you play Lulu instead of Proskenion here, then the board is even stronger, since Lulu is a better disruption than Proskenion. In practice though, the opponent will likely be able to prevent some of these disruptions. Cards like Called by the Grave or Bestials are very good at trading with your graveyard revival effects. Also, in the interest of playing safe, you will probably prefer to sacrifice the sheer number of disruptions in favor of more reliable ones. You can do this by targeting Albaz with Quem while Rindbrum is in the graveyard, allowing you to chain the Rindbrum to the opponent's attempt to banish the Albaz. You can also use Banishment to make Dragostopelia with only your own monsters, just to ensure you can resolve a graveyard revival effect afterwards, by using it when the opponent can't respond due to Branded Lost. Having Mercurier in hand from the very beginning of the opponent's turn instead of searching for it after you fusion summon is another way in which this line provides reliability. This end board is strongest against decks that are vulnerable to being fused with, such as Torments, Mathmech, Manadium, Sprite, the Mirror Match, or any other deck that likes to summon a lot of light or dark monsters. On the other hand, it is weaker against back row decks that don't do much on its first turn, like Labyrinth, Runic Stun, and Pure Stun. This will be a common theme for a lot of the branded combos in this video. Against these kind of decks, the best way to use this end board is often to go out of your way to make sure you can put Furious Dragon onto the field, so that you can destroy a back row right away, and then have the effect ready again for turn 3 in case the opponent flips a Floodgate. hard drawing cards like Max C, Super Poly, or Bistles alongside this combo will exaggerate the strength of the end board in the matchups it is good against, but won't be much help in the matchups it is weak to. Conversely, hard drawing cards like Branded King, Branded in Red, and Fusion Duplication will give the end board better tools against its bad matchups, but also won't impede its ability to be strong in its good matchups. This is something to consider when deciding which card to discard with Lubellion, or any other discard effect. If you don't know what the opponent is playing, it's better to lean towards reliability and matchup coverage. But if you do know the opponent's deck is one of the good matchups for this combos and board, you can choose to keep the win more cards like Super Poly and Bistles. Depending on the exact context of the game, there are other considerations here too. If you are playing game 2 or 3 of a match in a tournament that has a side deck, you might want to consider which side cards your opponent could have drawn to break your board. Branded King can negate evenly matched, for example, and Fusion Duplication can easily put a monster on the opponent's field during the battle phase using Sanctifier, which also beats evenly matched. If the tournament has no side deck, you'll know the opponent is most likely only playing with their engine cards and generic hand traps. Now for how you can improve the end board using the other cards in your hand. The easiest thing to look out for is any surge target that doesn't get used over the course of the combo, either in your turn or during the opponent's turn. In this case, Shrouded Dragon, Retribution, Branded King, Branded in Red, Kit, and Branded in White are all not used at any point during the combo. If you are playing a bigger branded deck with more surge targets, then more cards can be added to this list. Branded Regained, Branded Sword, Branded Beast, Ad Libitum, and Dogmatica Maximus are also not used in the combo. Drawing any of these alongside the combo will cleanly extend in a straightforward way. Since you don't use these cards in the combo, they can just add whatever value they have on their own onto the end board. The exception here is Branded in White, since the card does nothing by itself. In order to get value out of Branded in White in this combo, you need to draw it alongside an additional Albaz, or some way to get Albaz into the graveyard. Branded in Red also doesn't provide extra disruption to the end board, unless every other disruption already goes through as planned. Branded in Red's only target would be the Albaz in the graveyard, which is the same target for Rindbrum and the main target for Quem. Since Branded in Red banishes the Albaz after fusing with it, in order to get full use out of your end board, you would need to wait and use the Branded in Red after everything else. So instead, what Branded in Red offers in practice is more reliability against the opponent trying to banish the Albaz. It also allows you to pivot into different kinds of disruption, most notably back row destruction with Chimera, making the end board better into its bad matchups. This reliability in matchup coverage makes Branded in Red the best single card to have to improve the end board, which makes it the preferred target to surge if you draw Kit 2. It's not so good that it's worth setting instead of the banishment, but it is admittedly very close. Some of these cards also only get their additional value when they are put into the graveyard, like Sword and Retribution. To add these cards' value to the end board, you'll need to spend Lubellion's discard on them. You might notice that there are no starter cards on this list of extenders. Branded Opening, High Spirits, Gold Sarcophagus, Serenir, Lubellion, or Branded Fusion itself will all undoubtedly improve this combo a lot if you draw them. But that would be a completely different combo to begin with, so there's not much point in going over it now. Another thing to look out for when trying to improve the combo is any of the surge targets that do get used in the combo. If you draw one of those cards, you can use whatever effect would normally search for it to search for something else instead. For example, drawing Banishment means you can use Albion to set Branded in Red instead. Or drawing Mercourier means you can search for something else with Branded Lost to extend, like Shrouded Dragon or Kit. In this case, the targets that get used in the combo are Branded Lost, Mercourier, and Banishment. But it's also Quem and Cartesia. Those last two are slightly different in that the combo actually gets messed up when you draw them. Cartesia isn't the end of the world to draw, since Fusion Deployment can also just summon it from the hand. Or slightly better is summoning Albaz from the deck, so that Cartesia can then summon itself from the hand. But Quem on the other hand is problematic to draw for this combo. Since Titaniclad can only summon from the deck, the combo doesn't work with Quem in the hand. To get around this, the combo has to make a slight adjustment. Here, instead of searching for Mare Courier, you're gonna want to search for Kit. The end board is almost as strong as before, and is arguably even better for certain matchups, even though you drew the quem. Remember that when you fuse on the opponent's turn, you can then search for the missing Mare Courier too. Now, since many branded players like to play the gimmick puppet, I'll show you how to perform a puppet lock with the same 2-card combo. It's important that you still go for branded lost here even though you won't be triggering it this turn. There's no Cartesia to add back since you shuffled it back into the deck with Libellion, but that's completely fine. When the puppet lock resolves, you usually win anyway, just as long as the matchup is right for it. By using the Sanctifier now, you're playing around a Bestial, or Called by the Grave banishing your puppet, since the opponent can't respond now due to branded lost. Just make sure to put the gimmick puppet on the opponent's field, and the Libellion on your own. Against combo decks, the puppet lock is even more of an auto-win than the regular board would be, but it lacks the reliability of being able to remain strong if the opponent is able to prevent the puppet lock. For example, a single Bestial will beat this line completely if it's used at the right time. All the opponent needs to do to nullify the puppet lock is to use the Bestial in your end phase targeting the puppet. At this point, Sanctifier can't be chained since it's not yet the opponent's turn, and there's no way to negate this outside of hard drawing specifically the one copy of Mare Courier, or by having some kind of extension that allowed you to search it during your turn through branded lost. What's even scarier is that if the opponent turns out to be playing a back row deck, like Labyrinth or Stun, the end board goes from being an auto-win to a near auto-loss. The puppet lock does nothing against these decks, and you have no other form of interaction that can be used to deal with the back row. The regular combo is weaker to back row decks too, but it's not as bad of situation to be in as this one. Even hard drawing Branded in Red, or Branded King, might not save you from a good Labyrinth hand setting 4 or 5 cards into your puppet lock. Branded in Red, for example, does not even have a target in this line. This is just one example of what I mentioned earlier about puppet not actually being the best thing you can do in Branded. But of course, it's very strong in the right matchups. If you know your opponent is playing a combo deck, and that combo deck typically doesn't include Bestials, then performing a puppet lock is probably the strongest thing you can do. For that reason, if you are ever playing a tournament that includes a side deck, the gimmick puppet should at least be played in the side, if you aren't already main decking it. If you know for a fact that you're playing against a back row deck, then the combo can be done slightly differently to be more targeted. The regular line is technically able to get to Furious Dragon on the opponent's turn, but you can also summon it directly with Libellion on the first turn instead of Mirror Jade. In order to do this, you will need to hard draw an additional dark dragon that you can discard with Libellion, since you don't want to have to use the Albion on the field for this. Albaz, Shrouded Dragon, or any bestial card can be the additional dark dragon that you need. The reason to do this would be that the Mirror Jade isn't very useful anyway when the opponent is just going to set back row. And having access to the Furious Dragon on your turn plays around any way the opponent could prevent you from summoning it on their turn. For example, Inspector Border, or a Mono Awato. Your plan is to destroy a random back row during their end phase, and then use the Furious Dragon again on your turn to either destroy a floodgate or hit a random back row that they can't chain because you used the effect right after a fusion summon while Branded Lost is on the field. Additionally, against back row decks, you should set Branded in red instead of Banishment. This allows you to destroy 2 more back row in the opponent's end phase. Branded King also has its place against back row decks, since it can be used to negate a floodgate or power trap, like Skill Drain, Karmic Cannon, Dimensional Barrier, or Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. However, when you get to go first with Branded, destroying the back row with Chimera and Furious Dragon is a better approach. Branded King does play a more important role in grindy games against back row decks though, since it's very easy for them to disallow you from destroying their cards once they get to set up their floodgates. This comes up a lot more when you have to play going second into back row decks. Drawing exactly a Lubber itself is not the only way to do this combo. Gold Sarcophagus instead of a Lubber leads to the exact same combo, except it starts by using Sark to banish Tragedy, which then searches the Lubber. In this case, you want to use the Gold Sark first, for no other reason than that you might gain some information about what hand traps the opponent has, based on the response windows. Remember, Max C can be chained to the Gold Sark, but Ash Blossom cannot. It lets you know if the opponent has Droll sooner too. Foolish Burial is the same story. You just use the Foolish first to send Tragedy, and search for the Lubber. Again, you want to start with Foolish, as it gains information on possible hand traps. An interesting difference about Foolish Burial though, is that the Tragedy in the Graveyard actually improves the combo ever so slightly. One way to use it is to simply leave it there for its follow-up effect to reset Branded Fusion, but you can also banish it with Albion as the Dark Monster to summon Lubellion, instead of the Aluber on the field. This allows you to use the Aluber alongside Cartesia as material for Gran Winyal, which puts it in the graveyard instead of banishing it. This lets you keep Lubellion on the field as a huge blocker. In the graveyard, the Aluber acts as an additional target for banishment, or branded in red. It can also use its own graveyard effect to special summon itself when the opponent clears one of your fusion monsters. This is often overlooked by many opponents, and you can catch them off guard with it pretty easily. Interestingly, Aluber in the graveyard can be a powerful tool against Mathmech by itself. Mathmech typically only clears your fusion monsters by destroying them with Access Code Talker. When this happens, you get to trigger the Aluber, stopping the access code from destroying anything else, reducing its attack back down to 2000, and special summoning an extra body to block with. This usually wins the game when it happens, as Mathmech can never OTK you afterwards thanks to Circular locking them into attacking with only one monster that turn. If you survive the turn against Mathmech, you'll immediately overwhelm them with your follow-up. The way for them to play around this is to co-link the access code to Transcode Talker, so that Aluber's effect can't target it. But with how good the end board is against Mathmech already, it's unlikely they will be able to get this far. Fusion Deployment and Branded Opening is also capable of doing the exact same combo as Fusion Deployment and Aluber, but with the added downside of needing an extra discard for opening. Branded Opening can be used in the draw phase to play around Droll and affect Veiler, however it's still better to go for the Fusion Deployment first here. This is because putting the Cartesia on the field first plays around Veiler anyway, but also Imperm too, and keeping the quick play opening in your hand lets play around Max C better as well. If the opponent chains Max C to deployment, you can chain the opening to special summon before the Max C resolves. It's also true that the combo doesn't get hurt much by Droll and Lockbird in the first place. The only search you really need is Aluber's search for Branded Fusion. Even though your normal summon is preserved, there's no way to make use of it that doesn't lead to an inferior end board. Searching Quem with Branded Lost is an option, but it's not as good as just using Titaniclad to get to Quem and spending the Branded Lost search on Mercourier like before. Having the destruction protection effect of Branded Opening in the graveyard is a nice bonus, but having to discard an extra card makes this combination a little bit worse than drawing the Aluber itself. As you can see, we are ending with the same end board as before. Since this combo doesn't use its normal summon though, it gets a lot better when you draw a normal summon alongside it, so let's take a look at how those lines play out. Here we have Fusion Deployment, Branded Opening, and Aluber. Like always, putting Cartesia onto the board plays better around Imperm and Valor. Even though you have two good targets for Imperm this time, it's still better to ensure that neither of them get negated. Make sure you put the Rindbrum in the extra monster zone here. If you don't, you will run out of zones later in the combo. This zone issue is the reason why we have to summon Rindbrum directly here, instead of going into Lubellion first, and then using its effect to summon the Rindbrum. It's important that you use the banished copy of Albaz, not the one in the graveyard. This end board has a Mirror Jade banish, a negate and bounce with Rindbrum, a banishment for a potential Dragostopelia or Furious Dragon. Sanctifier to summon Albaz, and Quem to summon either Albaz, Cartesia, or Mirror Jade. This is potentially 7 or 8 disruptions depending on how you count them, as well as a huge amount of follow-up. The Sanctifier here allows you to forcefully fuse into anything you want with Albaz, no matter what monsters the opponent puts on the board. This is great against back row decks since it allows you to get to Furious Dragon very easily. There's also Branded Opening in the graveyard, which has good synergy with Furious Dragon and can be annoying for Runic to push through. Against combo decks or mid-range decks, the amount of banishing and fusing this board has access to is probably going to overwhelm them. And Sanctifier being already on the end board makes it very easy to be evenly matched. One thing to note that is different than the other combos we've seen so far is that the Branded Lost is not able to search for Mare Courier when we fusion summon on the opponent's turn since it's currently banished, and the deck list only plays 1. If instead you play 2, then of course this combo becomes even stronger. Improving this end board using the other cards you draw is pretty difficult since both of them get discarded over the course of the combo. But it is possible to make slight improvements by drawing certain cards. Drawing Mare Courier, for example, would allow you to send a different card with Quem, like Retribution, or Branded Sword if you're playing it. Drawing Tragedy would allow you to search for the second copy of Aluber, but only when discarded with Opening, since Opening discards for effect, while Lubellion discards as a cost. Retribution is also a good card to draw here since it also gets value when you discard it. Drawing any of these cards would allow you to put an extra card into your hand before needing to discard with Lubellion. This means that if one of the 2 unknown cards in your opening hand is a non-engine card, like Max C or Super Poly, you are able to keep it instead of needing to discard it. In the case of drawing Tragedy, you actually don't even need to draw the normal summon, since discarding Tragedy for opening will allow you to simply search for it. This combo works the exact same way whether you draw Aluber as the normal summon, or Quem, since opening can just summon whichever one you are missing. Remember that Foolish Burial and Gold Sarcophagus are equivalent to drawing Aluber or Quem too. So either of those cards would lead to the exact same combo here too. Drawing Quem has slightly better implications for playing around Droll, since you can use the opening in the draw phase to also get the Aluber search in the draw phase. However, I really don't like respecting Duel this way, since you play into max C and imperm a lot more than you need to. Also, even though this combo searches a lot of cards, you're still going to be able to end on a strong board if you get Dueled. In general, Branded is pretty resistant to Duel, and I recommend you prioritize respecting the other hand traps that you are capable of respecting. Speaking of hand traps, I wanted to point out that this combo is pretty good into Ash Blossom as well. If your Branded Fusion gets ashed, you still have an acceptable line available to you. On the opponent's turn, you can use the Cartesia to summon out Sanctifier, which can then trigger the Quem to bring back Mercourier, which is able to use its negation effect while on the field too. With Albaz in the graveyard, the Sanctifier is able to summon it out to fuse with your opponent's monster, potentially summoning a Mirror Jade for further disruption and follow-up. It's pretty good considering that the opponent was able to successfully negate your Branded Fusion. Of course, you can also perform a Puppet Lock using these cards too. It's important that you don't set the Branded in red, and instead you add it to the hand, because you're gonna activate it right away. Although if you do set it, you can still Puppet Lock the opponent, it's just slightly more vulnerable to Called by the Grave, or a top-decked Bestial. Another important combo to know is Fusion Deployment plus Serenir. This is a lower power combo that has to access Branded Fusion through more complicated means. It's not bad considering you didn't draw a direct way to Branded Fusion, but it's still weaker than other combos. This end board has a Mirror Jade Banish, a banishment for Dragostopelia, and a Mercurier Negate searched by Branded Lost if the banishment is able to successfully resolve. There's also Grand Wignal for the free Quem or Proskenion if the opponent triggers it. Now, for the last part of these fusion deployment combos, let's go over what you can do when you just straight up draw the branded fusion itself. It might surprise you to find out that the combos with branded fusion itself are not actually always stronger than the ones where you search it through a looper. Similar to the combo we saw earlier with fusion deployment and opening, it ends up being slightly worse even though you aren't forced to commit your normal summon at the start. That being said, in practice, branded fusion is still the best draw in the deck because of how good it is going second, how good it is against hand traps, and how good it is when paired with multiple other good starter cards. In the case of this combo though, it's not better than drawing a looper directly. This end board has a Mirror Jade Banish, a branded in red with 3 different targets, an Albaz in the graveyard to revive with Quem or Rindbrum, and a Grand Wignal on the field that can summon out Proskenion. The best way to use this end board would be to send Rindbrum with Mirror Jade, and then try to use it, or the Quem, to revive the Albaz and fuse with the opponent's monster. Then you want to use the branded in red targeting the Tragedy to go into Chimera and banish the spent monsters on the field, as well as the Tragedy, to destroy 2 of your opponent's cards. In most cases, Chimera wants to be destroying 2 and drawing 1 since branded never struggles to find follow-up anyway. And this combo is no exception to that. The best way to improve this combo is to hard draw a way to get to a looper. Branded fusion is strongest when it's being used to summon Albion since it has the strongest effect in the end phase and allows you to get to Branded Lost for free through Lubellion. Having to summon something else with the branded fusion is more often than not a concession. Still, this end board is incredibly strong, and hard drawing any other starter or search target will improve the combo a lot. So to bring all these fusion deployment combo ideas together, here are a couple examples of how you might perform this combo with real hands. You can see in this first hand that we have a fusion deployment plus a looper combo, but instead of drawing a looper, we drew the extra step of Gold Sarcophagus. We also drew the Quem, which isn't ideal, but as we went over before, there is a line that makes it work. We have Retribution, which is a search target that isn't used in the combo, and requires being discarded to get its value. Lastly, we also drew Banishment, so we'll need to set the next best thing with Albion in the end phase instead. We start with Gold Sarc to see if our opponent shows us any response windows. We go for Cartesia before we normal summon in order to play around Imperm and Valor. Lubellion activates, and we discard the Retribution, and we go up into the Mirror Jade. It's in the extra monster zone so that we are less likely to ever run out of space in the main monster zones. The chain order doesn't actually matter here because our opponent can't respond anyway. We needed to go for Kit here because we want to put the Quem back into the deck so it can be summoned out again with the Titaniclad. In the pure line, I recommended getting branded in red here, but since we already have banishment in our hand, the Albion in the end phase is capable of getting to branded in red for us. The next best target after branded in red is Retribution, but that's already in the graveyard because we discarded it for Libellion earlier. Now since Kit is able to add from the graveyard too, we could just add back the Retribution here. However, Kit is even able to add from the banished zone as well, so to get the most value from this Retribution, we want to chain its effect to Kit, adding back our branded fusion before adding the Retribution itself back to our hand. From here, we are in a strong position to win the game. One additional thing to note is that by setting the branded in red with Albion, we are showing the opponent its position in the back row. This means that it's easier for the opponent to force the branded in red with spot removal, which can be an issue because branded in red is by far our strongest card on the end board if the opponent is playing a back row deck. Runic Destruction, for example, would take away the option of destroying back row with Chimera. But even if they aren't playing a back row deck, forcing branded in red right away can be tricky for us since the card ideally gets used later on the turn. Since we set two unknown cards from our hand, the Retribution and the Banishment, we could have played around this issue by searching for the branded in red and setting it from our hand instead. This would hide its position in the back row, adding more reliability to our end board. Retribution is already out of the deck here, so our Albion would have to set branded King instead. The version we went for has more follow-up, since it gets to use Retribution's recycling effect twice, and also has a stronger matchup against combo or mid-range decks, since Retribution's field effect is stronger than branded King's. Either option would have been completely fine, but I just thought I'd mention both. This second hand has the deployment plus opening plus a normal summon combo. It also drew the Mare Courier, which we would have otherwise wanted to send to the graveyard with Quem. This means we'll have to discard it for the opening, which will allow us to send a bonus card with Quem instead. And then we also drew this Droll, which is just a non-engine card. The reason we choose to summon the Quem before normal summoning the Aluber is because we are less interested in protecting its on-summon effect since we already have the preferred target in the graveyard anyway. If the opponent uses Imperm or Valor here, we would actually let it resolve, since we don't actually need whatever card Quem is going to send to the graveyard. It's better to preserve the Cartesia effect to play around a second Imperm or Valor on the Aluber. The best cards to send with Quem when you don't need anything specific are usually either Albaz or Retribution. In this case, we choose Retribution because it's going to allow us to put an extra card into our hand, so that we don't need to discard this Droll for Libellion. Remember, the Rintbrum needs to be in the extra monster zone, or we will run out of space in our main monster zones. This end board is very powerful, and we were even able to keep the Duel in our hand too. These next combos involve drawing the bestials. Like I mentioned in the deck theory section of the video, Serenir and Lebellion are actually good starter cards in the branded deck. So let's see how the combos work when we draw them. This first combo is with Lebellion and Aluber. In the past, it was good to use the Lebellion before going for Aluber, since the opponent would sometimes waste their Ash Blossom on it. However, since Dragon Link isn't much of a deck anymore, it's not likely they will use Ash on Lebellion, so it's better to play around Duel instead. Duel is more common in the current format too. If you only get one of these searches, you'd much rather it be for branded fusion than a Serenir. You want to summon the Lebellion before the Cartesia so that you can better play around Nibiru. If you go for the Cartesia first, and the opponent has Nibiru, they can prevent you from getting to Branded Lost by using Nibiru on the summon of Lebellion, since it will be summon number 5. So it's better to wait until after before summoning the Cartesia. This end board has a lot of interaction on the opponent's turn. You have a Banish with Mirror Jade, and Negate and Bounce with Rindbrum, and Banishment for Dragostopelia, and Quem to revive Albaz. You also have Branded Lost, which can search for another Albaz, which can then be used with Cartesia's effect to go into other strong fusion plays like Sanctifier, or Albion into Furious Dragon. The Mare Courier is not an option since it's banished, but if your list plays 2 copies, then you have the option of getting an extra monster Negate instead. This end board is exceptionally strong against combo decks and mid-range decks, since you have so many removal effects. Cards like Max C, additional Bestials, and Super Poly will make this matchup even easier for you if you hard draw them alongside the combo. You'll notice that there are 4 unknown cards in our hand still, since this combo doesn't require any discards, and we even drew an extra card with the Shrouded Dragon. So backing this board up with non-engine cards is very common. The bad matchups for this end board would again be back row decks, since the monster removal we have isn't going to be very useful. Setting Branded in red instead of Banishment would be a good way to hedge the end board against the back row matchups, since it will allow you to have the strong play of destroying 2 back row in the opponent's end phase with Guardian Chimera. Hard drawing Fusion Duplication, Branded King, or the Branded in red itself will also help make this board better into back row. It's very easy to improve this board with additional cards, since you have 4 cards left over that could potentially extend. The best thing to look out for here would be any way to get access to the Branded in red. Kit, for example, would be able to get you to it. You can also draw Cartesia or Shrouded Dragon directly, since that would allow you to search for Kit with the Branded Lost instead of spending the search on Shrouded Dragon. Another thing to note here is that Rindbrum could have also returned the Lebellion to your hand. I don't like doing that in this specific combo though, since the Lebellion has a lot of defense, and it's not like you can use the hand effect again to search for another Bestial. You can also do a similar combo if you draw Serenir instead of Lebellion, although it is considerably weaker. As you can see, this end board is a lot worse than the previous combo. The only target for banishment here is Grand Wignol, which is not ideal, since it means you might not be able to get the free Quem. Branded in red would have been even worse though, since there's no target for that at all. Instead, you could consider setting Branded King in this line over banishment. I still personally prefer the banishment though. Remember that banishment always has the backup use of just being Monster Reborn for the Mirror Jade, which is why I consider it to be the best target for Albion. Another option was to send Titaniclad instead of the Albion, so that instead of setting something, you could summon out Quem and put an Albaz into the graveyard. This is an okay option, but it loses some of its reliability when you don't have Rinbrum in the extra deck. Also, the Grand Wignol is already able to access the Quem if you don't banish it with banishment. Having it in the extra deck means you can send it to the graveyard at any time with Mirror Jade, to help ensure that the Albaz doesn't get banished by a Bestial or called by the grave. In practice though, even though this board is weak in the pure line, it's very easily improved by the other cards you draw. Here is an example of how drawing a Surge target can breathe new life into this weaker Serenir combo. This time we have Cartesia as well. Take a look at the difference that it makes to the end board. It's important that you use the Allure to make the Grand Wignol, not the Serenir, since you are going to be needing that Serenir to summon out Libellion. The reason to do this now is because you want to take advantage of the safety window provided by Branded Lost. If the opponent chained a hand trap to your Mirror Jade, you wouldn't be able to negate the Jade with Rinbrum, which not only means you have to banish a monster, but also prevents you from using Mirror Jade again on the opponent's turn. Most of the time you won't need to worry about this, since the vast majority of hand traps get used before this point. But it is possible that the opponent could save something like a Bestial, Imperm, or DD Crow for specifically this moment. If the opponent is playing Labyrinth and they are familiar with the line you are going for, they could also choose to use their furniture effects in response to Mirror Jade, which would actually turn them into effective hand traps against your combo. This is similar to how furniture can be used against Pearly to prevent Plump from attaching extra memories. By using the Mirror Jade while under the protection of Branded Lost though, you are avoiding this issue completely. Also, notice that since you haven't used Libellion's effect to search this turn, it's better to return it to the hand this time. As you can see, this end board is much stronger than before. Drawing Kit, Shrouded Dragon, or even branded Lost directly too, can also result in similar end boards to this one. Like most of these combos, there's a version that can also perform a puppet lock. Here's how to puppet lock using Allure plus Lubellion. Since there's no banishment to help create a branded Lost protection window, you should go right ahead and use the Sanctifier right away. That way, you're not allowing the opponent to start their turn with an immediate special summon, like Fenrir or Unicorn. If your deck is also playing Magnamut, there's a really cool line you can do when you draw Lubellion and Serenir, as well as the Allure. This neat little trick lets you put two different Bestials into your hand to use on the opponent's turn. One of those Bestials is of course Magnamut, so it will eventually become a third Bestial too. If you're playing against a matchup that is vulnerable to Bestials, like Tearlaments, the Mirror Match, or Mathmech, you're almost certainly winning the game with this end board. Magnamut isn't in my recommended list, but it's not a bad card to play at all. If you're on 60 card branded, then Magna is for sure gonna be in your deck. Another important combo to know with the Bestials is what they can do on their own. If you draw a handful of Bestials like this, including both Lubellion, you can actually still put up an acceptable board by utilizing a very rarely used line of text on Lubellion. Specifically, the fact that it can also be summoned from the hand. This end board is actually pretty good. You have a banish with Mirror Jade, a big negate with branded King, an Albaz in the graveyard to revive with either Quem or Rintbrum, and a branded Lost Search for Mare Courier after you fusion summon. If Magnamut is in your deck, you could also have an extra Druisworm in your hand here, since instead of using the Druisworm earlier, you would have gone for Magna instead. This line is one example of how Anaconda sometimes saves the day. If you weren't playing Anaconda, the best end board for this hand would have been a completely empty board. You will have also noticed the use of High Spirits, which wasn't essential for making a decent board, but it did help make the board better. What's also interesting is that it plays very well into Ash Blossom, since it doesn't try to use branded fusion and instead goes for Anaconda. When we get to the High Spirit section of the combos, you'll see that this is a running theme for a lot of combos with that card. But before moving on to that, let's go through an example of how you might do a Bestial combo with a real hand. You can see right away that we have Lubellion, as well as Foolish Burial, which is just a Luber with extra steps. We also a copy of Thrust, which means we have some ability to play through Ash. We have a Super Poly, which is a good non-engine card to back up our board. And then we also have this random Albaz chilling in our hand too. The reason we don't want to start with the Foolish Burial is that it takes 2 searches for it to get to branded fusion. So if the opponent has Droll, we'd be pretty stuck. We wouldn't be able to search with our Luber, and the Lubellion wouldn't be able to search either. However, by going for the Serenir first, we still leave ourselves a play if the opponent has Droll. Because we also drew this Albaz to normal summon, we could special summon the Serenir by banishing the Lubellion, normal summon the Albaz, and then link into Anaconda. Remember that we prefer putting a Luber in the graveyard since the Lubellion has a bigger body, and the Luber becomes a target for banishment. The draw we get doesn't matter, but it would be nice to find something like Fusion Duplication or Branded in Red to help beat a back row deck. The worst draw would actually be Quem, since we've already used our normal summon, and Titaniclad is unable to summon it from the hand. If we did draw the Quem, the best option we have available to us in this hand is to discard it for Super Poly on the opponent's turn. And then after that, target it with Banishment to bring it back to the field. Remember that Banishment doesn't have to fuse with the monster you revive, so we could keep the Quem on the field, and then potentially use both of its effects. Again, we're respecting the possibility of running out of main monster zones. So far this has all been the exact same as the pure line, and that makes sense since the Albaz in our hand is not really offering any extension, so there's no need to let it distract us. Remember that the end board for this combo has Cartesia on the field. So we can easily make good use of this Albaz for a Cartesia play on the opponent's turn. It's important that we don't instinctively add back Cartesia, since we want to actually revive it to the field instead. This is very close to being the exact end board in the pure line we saw earlier. The additions here are a copy of Super Poly, as well as an extra Albaz in hand, which means our Cartesia can make Albaz fusions, even if we never end up getting the Albaz in our graveyard onto the field. Next, let's look at what combos you can do with Branded and High Spirits. Remember that High Spirits is in general very good at playing against Ash, so we'll go through some of those lines as they come up. This first combo is with High Spirits and Lubellion. You send Cartesia with Branded Fusion because you already have Lubellion in the graveyard. And you use the Quem as Chain Link 2 here to play around Ghost Bell, negating your Albion, which is the more important effect to resolve. This end board has a Mirror Jade Banish, a Banishment, a Mare Courier, and an Albaz in the graveyard for Quem and Rindbrum. You're pretty well set up to deal with combo decks with this end board, but it might struggle to beat a back row deck. So the best way to improve this line would be to hard draw an answer to back row, like some way to get to Branded in Red, or Branded King. If you draw any card that you can normal summon alongside this combo, you can also do a completely different line that plays around Ash Blossom. Setting Opening is to allow you to summon Quem on the opponent's turn. The Quem can then send a second Albaz, so that you have more options with how to use the Branded in Red. Or it can send Cartesia, and then attempt to revive that Cartesia later on. Remember that Anaconda prevents you from special summoning for the rest of the turn, so you can't add the opening and then use it to summon Quem right away. As always, you have the option of reviving the Albaz with Rindbrum and searching for Mare Courier after you fusion summon. If the opponent does have Ash, then they will most likely use it on Albion's effect in the end phase. This means that you should send whichever spell you think is more important to have with the Shrouded Dragon, and then set the less important spell with Albion. In this pure line, the Quem is doing more here, making opening the more important spell, but in practice, the other cards in your hand will probably make Branded in Red the better card, which is why we set opening with Albion. You don't set Banishment in this line at all because there's no target for it in the graveyard, but you could consider going for Branded King instead of one of the spells. I'd prefer the double spell setup though, since it also generates a lot of potential follow-up. The next combo is with High Spirits and Albaz. This combo also has a version that plays around Ash when you draw any card to normal summon alongside it, but here's the line that doesn't respect Ash. We use high spirits in the draw phase here to play around Duel. And here is the version that plays around Ash. This end board has Mirror Jade, Mare Courier, Albaz in the graveyard for Rindbrum, and then branded in red as well, for a potential 5 disruptions, depending on what you're able to fuse into with Albaz. What's also worth pointing out about these lines where we normal summon a hand trap to make Anaconda, is that the normal summon could also very easily be your real normal summon, instead of a random hand trap. If you have a Lubert or Quem to normal summon instead, then you could easily add extra value to the end board, while still completely playing around Ash. In this combo you don't actually draw high spirits, but the best way to play this hand is to search for it instead of branded fusion. This combo plays around Ash, and ends with a respectable amount of disruption. You have 2 Albaz in the graveyard, so you can summon one with Rindbrum at any time, while also having a target for branded in red at any time too. And of course, you can also puppet lock using high spirits. Here is an example of how you might do that. You have to get Shrouded Dragon here, since you need to put Albaz into the graveyard so that there's a target for branded in red. What's worth noting is that this combo does not set up a fusion summon on the opponent's turn in addition to the puppet lock. This means that you cannot make use of Branded Lost to prevent the opponent from being able to respond to Sanctifier. In general, High Spirits is a bit worse at creating puppet locks than other starters, because it doesn't have as much reliability. Even if you play the puppet in your deck, I wouldn't recommend going for a puppet lock with a High Spirits line like this one, since it's so easily stopped by a Bestial or called by the grave. If you do, you should try to use the other cards in your hand to set up a fusion summon on the opponent's turn. Now let's look at a couple example hands for how you might play out these High Spirits combos in practice. This first hand has the combo of Libellion plus High Spirits. And then it also has some monsters that it can normal summon. We have this Cartesia, and then we have 2 copies of Duel. Since we drew a normal summon, we have the option of playing around Ash Blossom, so let's go for that version of the combo. One of the monsters in our hand is going to be normal summon to make Anaconda, and since Cartesia would be able to add itself back to our hand in the end phase, it makes the most sense to use it as the normal summon here. We could have normal summoned Cartesia first, so that we could dodge Imperm on the kit, but I think it's actually better not to do that in this case. The reason for that is that we don't need Kit Surge to resolve in order to summon Anaconda, and Anaconda's effect is the more important one to resolve here. If we normal summon the Cartesia first, the opponent is disincentivized to use Imperm on the kit if they have it, and so they would end up using Imperm on the Anaconda instead. Remember that we can't use the opening this turn to special summon, because of Anaconda's restriction. This next hand has High Spirits and Albaz, which is a 2-card combo by itself. But with any normal summon in addition to it, a line that plays through Ash can be done instead. We don't have a normal summon immediately in this hand, but the Foolish Burial is just a lure with extra steps, so we can still go for the Anaconda line to play around Ash. Since we also drew none of the cards that punish Ash, as well as Super Poly being dead in a lot of matchups, playing into Ash is very scary for this hand, so it's definitely better to play around it. Normally you want to use High Spirits in the draw phase to respect Duel, but if you have another Surge that you can use first, it's better to go for that, since High Spirits is a quick play spell, and can be chained to the Duel to Surge anyway. A downside to using the Foolish first though, is that it reveals to the opponent that we have access to Branded Fusion. This is relevant since some players who understand Branded very well might actually use Ash on High Spirits, predicting that we are trying to go for Anaconda instead of Branded Fusion. Since we revealed that we have a looper in our hand, there's no way the opponent would now use Ash on the High Spirits still. Overall, this is a minor consideration, but it's potentially worth playing around if Duel was non-existent in the format. Going for kit first here plays better around max C, since it allows us to save our looper search for after we know whether or not we have to play under max C. Since this combo normally doesn't put a target for banishment in the graveyard, the Albion normally gets used to set branded in red. Since we have a looper as our normal summon though, our end board is going to have a target for banishment, which means we can get to banishment as well as branded in red. The reason we go for branded in red with the Aluber and banishment with the Albion, instead of the other way around, is to better play around Imperm on the Anaconda. The opponent is disincentivized to use Imperm on Anaconda here, since they know we have branded in red, which can chain to Imperm, add back the Aluber, and then banish the Aluber and the Anaconda to summon Quiritis or Masquerade. We don't actually play either of those cards in the deck list, but the opponent doesn't know that, so they might not use Imperm if they have it. This is a good end board, especially considering that we played around Ash Blossom. So now let's look at some simpler combos. Branded usually prefers to play with multiple starter cards, but there are still a number of one-card combos available to the deck. To start off, let's see what you can do with just a single Aluber. You want to get banishment here so that you can try to fusion summon on the opponent's turn. That way you can trigger branded loss to get Mare Courier for an extra disruption. This board is not amazing, but it's still potentially 4 disruptions. If you have opening instead of Aluber, you have a slightly better line available to you. You want to go for opening here in the draw phase to respect Duel. Even though I usually recommend saving opening for the main phase to better play around max C instead, that only works when you have another play to force the max C before using opening. In this case, opening is your only play, so the opponent will be able to chain max C if they have it anyway. This end board might look weird, but it's actually pretty strong, with potentially 5 disruptions, as well as more follow-up than when you start with Aluber. The banishment can revive the Mirror Jade, and Albaz in the graveyard means that you have the option of reviving it with Quem or Rindbrum. Branded Fusion on its own is ironically the weakest of all these one-card combos. The best you can do is the old classic from the very first version of Branded. The branded in red allows you to summon Chimera by adding back the tragedy, which can then destroy cards, draw, and search with tragedy for Quem. This is technically only 2 disruptions, but we all know how good Mirror Jade plus branded in red can be in practice. That's it for the combo section of the video. Remember that even though these end boards are fairly strong on their own, branded is still a non-linear combo deck. Most hands will have some way to improve on the pure lines using the other cards that you draw. So now let's move on to looking at how to play some of the common matchups for branded. When you're going first against super heavy samurai, you want to play around hand traps as much as you possibly can. Most super heavy samurai decks will play at least 12 hand traps, but usually even more, so you're pretty likely to get hit with 2 or 3 of them. You should always use opening in the draw phase to play around Duel and Valor, and you should consider summoning Lubellion with branded fusion instead of Albion in order to play around DD Crow. Cartesia is very good at playing around hand traps, since you can always chain her effect to dodge cards like Valor and Mourner, and she can also use her effect again on the opponent's turn if she was hand trapped on your turn herself. It doesn't matter if you make a weaker board than usual, since super heavy samurai will struggle to push through even a mediocre board from branded. When it comes to using your disruptions against super heavy samurai, there's a few key points to look out for. If your banishment target is Albion, then the best time to use the banishment would be as soon as they summon Wakaushi from the scale using its effect. You want to banish the Albion and the Wakaushi to summon Dragostopelia. Since Wakaushi is the only dark monster in the deck, it's your only opportunity to make Dragostopelia by using an opponent's monster. Wakaushi would normally be used as synchro material, which would trigger its effect to put itself back into the pendulum scale. This means that by banishing the Wakaushi here, you're also preventing the opponent from setting up their pendulum scales for a pendulum summon. Also, it's important that you use banishment as soon as Wakaushi's effect resolves, since you will also be denying the opponent the ability to activate the Big Benkei scale effect right away. If you have Mirror Jade, you should use it to banish the Soul Piercer, or a normal summoned wagon. Banishing Soul Piercer is important since it would otherwise trigger in the graveyard immediately after being linked into Scarecrow. Since super heavy samurai usually wants to trigger Soul Piercer multiple times in its combo, you're getting the most value out of the Mirror Jade by banishing it right away. Soul Piercer will often be their normal summon, but it will sometimes be Wagon instead. If the opponent normal summons Wagon, you can go ahead and banish it with Mirror Jade right away. There's no need to bother waiting for Soul Piercer, as they have no way of getting it onto the field after already using their normal summon, since banishment will deny them access to pendulum scales. Technically, you don't have to banish Wagon with Mirror Jade right away, since Wagon's effect requires itself to change battle position in order to search, so chaining Mirror Jade in response to the effect will prevent the search anyway, and will force them to waste the hard once per turn effect. I don't recommend doing this though, because the benefit is extremely slight, and you can be punished by the opponent linking into Scarecrow right away instead of using Wagon's effect. This could matter because putting Wagon into the graveyard makes Scales a better card. When you're trying to use Albaz to fuse with the opponent's monsters, remember that since they're all Earth, you can't fuse into any of your good Albaz fusions, but you can always make Sprint, which can often be good enough as it would still remove a monster with the Albaz effect. When you're going second against super heavy samurai, it's essential that you draw either Max C, Droll, or Super Polymerization. If you don't draw one of these cards, it's pretty unlikely that you'll win, as long as the opponent doesn't brick. When using Droll or Max C, make sure to never use them at a time where the opponent has no monsters on their field, as you don't want to play into Gamma. You should also always use Max C in response to an effect that special summons, rather than using it preemptively, as you want to make sure you get at least one draw if the Max C resolves. This is important because super heavy samurai plays a lot of hand traps, and so there's a strong chance that they will have some in their hand, which means it's better to have as many cards as possible to help push through those hand traps. The best place to use Max C is probably in response to Scarecrow, as the opponent will have to discard a card first, and there's a chance they discard a hand trap. If you're playing Mud Dragon, Super Poly can summon it using the opponent's Appaloosa and Baron de Fleur. This is a strong play, but you should recognize that it's not game-winning by itself. The opponent will still have Regulus and Savage Dragon, as well as whatever hand traps they drew. Remember that the standard super heavy samurai combo also uses Tunneler to draw 2 cards, which means there's an even higher chance of there being hand traps in the opponent's hand. Since you're down to just 4 cards in hand after using Super Poly, it's still probably going to be difficult to win. A better way to use Super Poly is to try and use it alongside Albaz, so that you can summon Mirror Jade using the opponent's Baron. Once Mirror Jade is on the board, it's very resilient to hand traps, and it can attack over the Appaloosa, while still being able to use its effect at any time. Remember that negating Mirror Jade's effect to banish is not very good, since it can just use it again on the next turn. It doesn't completely out the board by itself, but it's a lot stronger than Mud Dragon, and you still have the rest of your hand to play with. Another way of doing this is to fuse Albaz with the Savage Dragon, attack over the Appaloosa, and then use the effect to banish. If the opponent chains Baron, then Mirror Jade's second effect will trigger, which will also then force the Regulus. If the opponent doesn't chain the Baron, you can simply banish it, and then force the Regulus during the end phase using the fusion that you sent for Mirror Jade's cost. One other cool thing you can do against Super Heavy Samurai is to send 5 Rainbow Magician to the graveyard using Branded Fusion, and then use its effect to put itself into the scale when you set a spell or trap card. Super Heavy Samurai can't play at all while Rainbow Magician is on the field, so this combo would auto-win the game if you pulled it off. 5 Rainbow Magician is a light monster, so you can send it with Branded Fusion to summon Albion. If you don't draw any cards to set from your hand, you can use Albion during the end phase to set a card from your deck, which will then trigger the Rainbow Magician. This isn't really useful against other decks though, so it's probably limited to being nothing more than a side deck trick. When you're going first against Mannadium, the most important monster to banish with Mirror Jade is the opponent's normal summon. If their normal summon is Room Heart, you're gonna want to banish it right away before they special summon one of the balls from their hand. If their normal summon is Reich Heart, then you want to banish that right away too before they link it off into Light Heart. If their normal summon is one of the balls, that indicates that they want to destroy it using Room Heart or Visa's Starfrost, in which case, you should wait until they activate one of those cards before banishing the ball with Mirror Jade. It's very difficult for Mannadium to extend after their normal summon is removed, so you can often win the game with just Mirror Jade. This means that playing around Ash Blossom by going for an Anaconda combo instead of Branded Fusion should be prioritized when you know you're playing against Mannadium. Going second against Mannadium is a lot harder, and it's very similar to the Super Heavy Samurai matchup. It's essential that you draw either Droll, Max C, or Super Poly, as their full combo is very difficult to beat otherwise. Unlike Super Heavy Samurai though, you can sometimes use the Bestials as effective hand traps in this matchup. The best time to use a Bestial against Mannadium would be after they try to revive Visa's Starfrost with Scareclaw Arrival. By doing this, you're also potentially denying them access to Astra Loud later in the turn too. One cool card you can play to counter Mannadium is Draco Equest. This card can be summoned with Super Poly using the opponent's Baron and Dissipator. The card can attack over Appaloosa or Elf, and then target the Dissipator in the graveyard to copy its effects in order to force whatever disruptions the opponent might have left. It's pretty much a stronger version of Mud Dragon, and it's a potential option for a side deck. In the Labyrinth matchup, the game usually revolves around Dimensional Barrier. When Labyrinth goes first, it has a very easy win condition against Branded in the form of Dimensional Barrier, which it can easily access through Lady Labyrinth. If you're able to combo going first against Labyrinth, it's very strong to have Branded in red on your end board. This will allow you to summon Guardian Chimera in the opponent's end phase to destroy 2 of their back row. It's also good to go for Furious Dragon as well if you're able to. The only cards that threaten you after you make a normal end board are Power Traps and Floodgates, like Skill Drain, Karma Cannon, D-Barrier, and Rivalry, so destroying them in the end phase before they can be chained is the best way to deal with them. If you suspect that the opponent has a furniture in hand, searching for Mercourier at some point during your combo is very strong, as it will allow you to negate the furniture when they try to use it during the end phase. When you're going second against Labyrinth, it's important to respect Dimensional Barrier wherever possible. The way you can do this is to keep quick effects like Opening, Bestials, and even Max C in your hand so that you can chain them in response to the opponent's normal trap cards. Doing this will prevent them from being able to chain the effect of Lady to get Dimensional Barrier from the deck. Remember that Coup Clock will allow them to activate it right away, so it's very important that you play around this. You also have to try and respect the possibility that they drew the D-Barrier directly. You can do this by starting the turn by summoning Cartesia, so that you can chain her effect in response to D-Barrier. In general, your game plan against Labyrinth going second is to try and banish the Lovely, since they only play one copy, and it's essential for their grind game. Without Lovely Labyrinth, the opponent is unable to reset D-Barrier to their field, which makes it a lot easier for you to win in the long run. The main way you want to banish Lovely is using Mirror Jade, but you can also do it with banishment too. If the Lovely is ever put into the graveyard, you can banish it with a Bestial, or with Called by the Grave, which is something that comes up often when the opponent draws the Lovely, as it will usually be discarded for their furniture effects. One other card that is pretty good against Labyrinth is Sanctifier Dragon. Sanctifier is good because it can't be targeted, which matters a lot for Big Welcome's graveyard effect. Since Mirror Jade can easily be outed by this effect, you can consider going for Sanctifier instead in certain situations. One scenario you might prefer Sanctifier over Mirror Jade is if you already have another way to banish the Lovely Labyrinth. Overall, Labyrinth is not a very challenging matchup when you're able to go first, but it's probably the single hardest matchup when you're going second. When you're playing against Runic, it doesn't matter which variant of the deck it is, the biggest weakness is Runic Fountain. If you can destroy Fountain, the opponent's grind game will be much worse. When you're going first against Runic, keep in mind that most Runic decks typically don't have room for many hand traps, so you're most likely only going to be dealing with Ashe and Max C. Runic Stun in particular doesn't usually even play those cards either. The exception to this is Runic Bestial, which of course plays a lot of Bestials, so you'll want to play around them in that matchup since Bestials are decent hand traps against Branded. When you're trying to destroy Fountain with Chimera, you can play around Huggin's protection effect by using 2 monsters from your field as material. This allows you to destroy both the Fountain and the Huggin at the same time, which prevents the Huggin from being able to protect the Fountain. You can also play around Huggin by using Branded Lost. After fusion summoning Chimera or Furious Dragon while Branded Lost is on the field, you can attempt to destroy Fountain during the time that the opponent can't respond. This prevents them from using a Runic spell to summon Huggin, but it won't stop a Huggin that's already on the field from using its protection effect, since Huggin's effect does not activate. If the opponent tries to play around this by summoning Huggin in response to the fusion spell, then they won't be able to use Fountain to draw on the resolution of the chain, thanks to Branded Lost. This also plays around freezing curses being used to negate your monster, and you can also do this to destroy specific floodgates too. Remember though, these Branded Lost plays only work if the fusion summon happened as Chain Link 1. Another good card in the Runic matchup is Cartesia, as it can play around freezing curses and flashing fire. Branded Opening is also very important to get into the graveyard, as one of Runic's only ways to remove your monsters is with flashing fire, which Branded Opening can protect from. Opening also allows you to use Furious Dragon easier, since you won't have to give up a monster in order to use its effect. Remember that if Branded Fusion is banished off the top of your deck, you can still get it back using Kit. Also, Lubellion can be used to recycle important surge targets back into the deck if they are banished by the Runic cards. If the opponent summons Chaos Angel using a light monster and a dark monster, you can out it pretty easily using Banishment, Super Poly, Branded King, or Mirror Jade's graveyard effect. Branded King is a particularly useful card in this matchup, as it can be used to negate Fountain, or Floodgates, and it also plays around Bestials for the Runic Bestial matchup, which is something that Banishment and Branded in Red don't do. If Runic Stun uses Time-Tearing Morganite, you can potentially win by decking the opponent out. All you have to do is not put anything on the board, except for maybe a set monster to block attacks. Most of the Runic cards require face-up cards on the opponent's board in order to activate, so you can prevent the opponent from being able to banish many cards off the top of your deck by simply doing nothing and passing turn over and over. Since the opponent is drawing 2 cards during their draw phase, it's likely that they will actually end up decking out before you do. This strategy is particularly effective if you're playing a 60-card version, or if the opponent activates Pot of Desires. The Branded Mirror match is pretty unique, as the games can often go longer than the usual 2 or 3 turns that Branded expects to play for. If both players play the matchup well, it's still in favor of the player that goes first, but there's a lot of chance to win going second with the right draws. If the player going first is playing Gimmick Puppet though, then the chances to win going second are much worse. In general, Banishment becomes an insanely powerful card in the mirror, since it will always be able to fusion summon a strong monster using only the opponent's monsters. This means that you can easily use Banishment as a way to revive your own monster, while also summoning out another one for free, as well as clearing the opponent's board. A lot of your decisions in the mirror match should be made with Banishment in mind. Branded Lost is usually the best way to go second in the mirror, as it will allow you to destroy the opponent's banishment without giving them a chance to chain it in response. It's also more common to set Retribution as a trap card, as it will allow you to negate the opponent's banishment or protect your own banishment from a bestial. Branded King can also be used to negate the opponent's banishment, or as a way to negate their branded fusion. Super Poly is a very good card to draw in this matchup, especially in combination with Proskenion, which can be used to summon powerful monsters out of the opponent's graveyard. When you're going second against Branded, you're not too happy about drawing Duel, since it's not usually very effective at stopping the deck. Bestials on the other hand are pretty solid, especially since you are playing Branded yourself. The best way to use a Bestial is to banish Albaz from the opponent's graveyard in response to Albion's effect, as it will prevent them from summoning Lubellion and consequently Mirror Jade, while also potentially forcing them to summon a different fusion monster using the Albion as material. If the opponent is forced to use Albion as material, then they won't be able to tribute it for Lubellion, which means they won't have access to Branded Lost or Banishment during the end phase. Overall, the mirror match is pretty complicated and situational, so it tends to also be fairly skillful. However, it does often get decided by the non-engine that the players draw as well. Pearly is a deck that doesn't see much play right now, but it might become relevant again after the release of Pearly Noir, so it's worth going over the matchup. When you're going first against Pearly, the end board you're looking to set up is Mirror Jade, Banishment, and Albaz in the graveyard. This setup will usually be enough to beat most Pearly hands, outside of the opponent drawing some good board breakers. You want to banish the first Pearly with Mirror Jade, by sending Rindbrum to the graveyard as cost. You should save Banishment until the opponent activates Lily's effect to rank up using a memory spell in the graveyard. In response to Lily, chain Banishment to revive Albion, and then banish Albion and the Lily to summon Dragostopelia. Since Lily's effect is hard once per turn, summoning out another Lily won't do anything for the opponent. When the second Pearly is summoned, you should use Rindbrum right away to revive Albaz. Then, use Albaz to fuse with the Pearly into Albion, which you can then use to summon out Furious Dragon. If you're not able to get the extra Albaz into the graveyard, you can still beat the entire Pearly engine by playing using the Dragostopelia to negate the second Pearly instead. This doesn't work if the opponent has the field spell though, since you won't be able to target the Pearly, but even in that situation, you're still easily winning, as you can just use Mare Courier to negate Pearly's effect to rank up anyway. If you don't already have Mare Courier, Branded Lost will allow you to search for it after you summon the Dragostopelia. The reason you want to avoid letting any of the cats rank up is so that you avoid triggering the My Friend Pearly's effect to add back 3 memories. If the Pearly player ever goes for Zeus, it's not a problem for you, since Mirror Jade will destroy it during the end phase, so it doesn't matter how many materials it has. Branded will then likely win the game using its follow-up next turn. When you're going second against Pearly, Duel is a very effective hand trap. The Bestials won't typically be able to do much, but there is a way you can potentially use them as a disruption. If the opponent discards a light or dark monster using a memory spell, then you can use the Bestial in response to another memory later in the turn in order to prevent the opponent from attaching it to their monster. This could potentially make a big difference, as it could prevent them from having enough materials to rank up their monster into Noir. When it comes to outing Noir, Branded has a couple of different options for how to do it. Firstly, if you're playing Herald of the Abyss, you can simply search this card with Thrust, and it'll out the Noir really easily. Sleepy Memory activating in the standby phase will fulfill the requirement for Thrust, so you won't even need to bait the opponent into activating a monster effect first. If you're not playing Herald of the Abyss, or you simply don't draw the Thrust, Branded can also out Noir using Mirror Jade's effect to destroy during the end phase. Most of the time though, Noir is going to be in defense position, which means you can't just summon Mirror Jade and then try to crash into it. One way to solve this problem is to use Sanctifier Dragon. Sanctifier can't be targeted by the Noir, which makes it particularly good at playing against it. Over the course of multiple turns, you can eventually use Sanctifier to summon a 3000 attack monster to the opponent's field in attack position. Then, on your next turn, you can crash Mirror Jade into that monster to destroy the Noir during the end phase. The opponent can play around this though by setting a happy memory to their field, which will allow them to protect the Noir from being destroyed by Mirror Jade. For this reason, it's actually better to summon a small monster to their field with Sanctifier instead, so that you can attack over it for a bunch of damage. If you do this enough times, you'll end up winning without ever needing to out the Noir at all. Remember that if the opponent ever switches Noir to attack position, you have the option of crashing Mirror Jade into it directly. Also, if Noir was summoned using Yeep, it'll return to the extra deck during the opponent's next end phase anyway, so you don't need to worry about outing it. And finally, keep in mind that Titaniclad can also get up to 3700 ATK, so if Noir's defense is ever lower than that, you can use Titaniclad to just attack over it, and it'll be unaffected by Noir's effect to shuffle it back into the extra deck too. Technically, Titaniclad can actually get to 4900 attack by using Proskenion and Shrouded Dragon as material, which is an option for if the opponent is able to get rid of your Sanctifier during a grind game. The Sword Soul matchup is fairly straightforward, but there's a couple things that I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, when you're going first against Sword Soul, don't be tempted to use Mirror Jade before the opponent has more than one monster on the board. If you use it while they have just one monster, Heavenly Dragon Circle would be problematic for you, since the opponent can chain it to tribute their monster, which would force you to banish one of your own monsters with Mirror Jade. For this reason, it's better to wait until they summon a token, and then use Mirror Jade to banish the token. If the opponent starts the turn with Vishuddha, you should use Banishment to summon Albion and then banish the Vishuddha to summon Dragostopelia. Another good play to know against Sword Soul is that you can actually easily beat their full combo using Super Polymerization. If the Sword Soul player performs a standard full combo of Baron de Fleur, Chi Shao, Proto's Lock, and Blackout, you can actually push through all of this using Allure and Super Polymerization. You start by normal summoning the Allure and activating the effect. Most players here will use Chi Shao in response, to which you can then chain Super Poly, fusing the Allure with the Protos and the Chi Shao into Proskenion. Since the Allure left the field before Chi Shao resolved, you'll still be able to search for Branded Fusion. Afterwards, go to the battle phase and attack over the Baron for 3200 damage. Remember that Proskenion deals burn damage when it destroys a monster by battle. Then, during main phase 2, you can use Proskenion to summon the Baron from the opponent's graveyard to your field. You now have 2 cards on your side of the field, but since the opponent doesn't control a worm monster, they aren't able to use the Blackout. Also, you can use the Baron to negate a card at any time, so even if the opponent also has Monk of the Tenyi on their field, the Blackout still won't be able to stop you. At this point, you can use the Baron to destroy the Blackout, or any other back row, and then you can use Branded Fusion to summon out Sanctifier. If the opponent has Ash Blossom for Branded Fusion, you can just negate it with Baron, meaning that they need to have drawn a second non-engine card to be able to stop you, like Imperm or Valor. Since Sword Soul doesn't usually generate a lot of follow-up, the Sanctifier Dragon will probably be enough to win the game from this position. Notice that if you're not playing Proskenion in your extra deck, you're probably not going to be able to break through such an end board. Vanquish Soul can be a tricky matchup for Branded. While its engine is not strong enough to hold back Branded completely, it usually only takes 1 or 2 non-engine cards in addition to their end board to make the game unwinnable. When you're able to go first and make a board against Vanquish Soul, it's typically pretty easy to win, providing that you have Mirror Jade. When the opponent normal summons Raisin, you should immediately chain Mirror Jade to banish the Raisin in response to its effect to search. The reason you want to chain now instead of waiting until later is because Raisin can't use both of its effects in the same chain. This is important because it denies the opponent an opportunity to reveal a monster in their hand for one of their effects, which is exactly what they need to do in order to summon Jiaolong from their hand. Since they can't summon Jiaolong, the opponent has no way to extend after the Mirror Jade resolves, aside from drawing specifically Stake Your Soul. If you had instead allowed the surge to resolve before using Mirror Jade, the opponent would be able to use Raisin to reveal the Jialong in response to Mirror Jade's effect, which would then allow them to summon Jialong on the next chain. It's worth noting that Caesar Valius and Heavy Borger don't help the opponent deal with Mirror Jade at all, since Mirror Jade doesn't target, so if they were to chain one these cards to tag out their Raisin back to hand, you would just banish whatever monster they summon instead. If the Vanquish Soul player uses Dimension Shifter on your first turn, the best play you can do is to use Branded Fusion to summon Lubellion with Albaz and Mare Courier. Since the Mare Courier gets banished, you can use it to search for either Springin's Kit or Cartesia, depending on the rest of your hand. You should also use the Lubellion to summon Dragostopelia instead of Mirror Jade. This is because Mirror Jade can't use its effect while Dimension Shifter is active, since it has to send a card to the graveyard for cost. You could also summon Rindbrum, but it's more reliable to go for Dragostopelia, since Vanquish Soul can play around Rindbrum easier, and they're unlikely to want to summon Rock while Dimension Shifter is active anyway. It's also not terrible to summon Mirror Jade anyway, since it will still threaten to destroy everything during the end phase if it gets removed from the field. Also, once the turn passes back to you, Mirror Jade can now use its effect, which makes it very powerful. I don't recommend going for this plan though, unless you drew other cards that can disrupt the opponent, since the Mirror Jade on its own cannot act as a disruption. Getting Kit is important for follow-up, as the Branded Fusion will get banished, so your only way to get it back on turn 3 is with Kit. In general, Dimension Shifter is a very tough hand trap to play through, since you can only ever make a mediocre board at best, and it's always very difficult to find follow-up. When you're going second against Vanquish Soul, the most threatening cards they can set up is Snow Devil and Fenrir. Most of the time the opponent won't have Fenrir, since it's limited to 1, but the Snow Devil is usually very easy for them to get to. Droll can be effective at preventing Snow Devil since their first surge is likely going to be for something else. If the opponent is able to set up the Snow Devil though, the game is not going to be so easy for you to win. In general, the way to approach a Vanquish Soul endboard that includes Snow Devil is to try and force them to activate it by summoning Furious Dragon or Chimera. After that, it's unlikely that you will have enough to push for lethal, so you should focus on trying to win a grind game instead. Typically that will involve setting Banishment to revive a Mirror Jade on the opponent's turn and using the follow-up that it provides to slowly outgrind the opponent. Remember that once they've used the Snow Devil, Vanquish Soul loses a lot of its power, and they are mainly reliant on Caesar to control the game, so focusing on trying to remove their Caesar is a good way to win in the long run. This matchup is usually pretty chaotic though, since a single hand trap from the Vanquish Soul player will likely be enough to stop you when you're going second. So that's all I have for the guide. I hope you found this helpful. It's my first time trying a scripted video, so let me know in the comments where I could improve. Don't forget to like the video, and thanks so much for watching.